The judge's hand stopped halfway down the page. That's the moment I knew my parents understood they had lost. Until then, my father had looked almost relaxed in his expensive gray suit, leaning back in his chair like a man already planning a celebration dinner. My mother sat beside him with her pearl earrings and soft little smile, the same smile she wore whenever she thought someone else was about to be humiliated. And that someone had always been me. By sunset, my father had said only minutes earlier loud enough for half the courtroom to hear, "Every Florida property will legally be ours." Mom gave a quiet laugh. She should be grateful we left her anything at all. I didn't answer them. I just sat there in my white navy dress uniform with my hands folded in my lap, staring at the old wooden railing in front of me, while the ceiling fans hummed overhead. The courtroom in Sarasota smelled faintly like paper furniture polish, and rain drifting in from the parking lot outside. Florida thunderstorms had rolled in early that afternoon, turning the windows gray. Most people in the room probably thought I looked calm. I wasn't calm. I was 62 years old, retired after 33 years in the Navy, and I still felt like the unwanted daughter sitting at my parents' dinner table trying not to say the wrong thing. Then Judge Holloway unfolded Aunt Margaret's letter. He adjusted his glasses once. "Read the first line," and froze. The silence that followed felt so complete I could hear the rain tapping against the courthouse windows. "Well," he said quietly. Then he looked directly at me. "That changes everything." My father's face drained white so fast it frightened me. Mom's hand tightened around her purse. And for the first time in my life, neither of them knew what to say. 3 hours earlier, before court began, I'd stood alone outside the building watching the storm clouds gather over Main Street. I remember touching the edge of my uniform jacket, feeling suddenly foolish for wearing it. My father hated seeing me in uniform. Said it embarrassed him. "You always look like you're trying to prove something," he once told me at Thanksgiving about 15 years earlier. Maybe I had been. But that morning I wore it because Aunt Margaret had asked me to years ago. If they ever corner you, she'd told me during one of our late-night phone calls, don't walk in there looking ashamed. You served your country. Let them look ashamed. I could still hear her voice clearly even after 6 months. Margaret wasn't really my aunt by blood. She was my mother's older cousin, though everyone just called her Aunt Margaret. She owned several modest rental properties along the Gulf Coast, nothing glamorous, mostly duplexes and small apartment buildings filled with retirees, veterans, and working families who'd lived there for years. To my father, they were assets. To Margaret, they were people. That was the difference. And that difference was exactly why we ended up in court. My younger brother Daniel sat beside my parents that morning, scrolling through his phone before the hearing even started. 58 years old and still acting like consequences were things that happened to other people. He looked up when he saw me entering the courtroom. "Well," he muttered, "look who came dressed for her own funeral." Dad chuckled. I ignored him and took my seat across the aisle. That had become my survival strategy decades earlier: silence. Not weakness. Silence. There's a difference older people understand better than younger ones. Sometimes silence is the only way to keep from saying something you can never take back. Growing up in Jacksonville in the 1970s, I learned early that my brother and I lived under different rules. Daniel was charming, funny, athletic. I was serious. Too serious, according to my father. When Daniel forgot chores, Dad laughed it off. When I forgot something, Dad called it irresponsibility. By high school, Daniel could do almost anything and still be treated like the family success story. Meanwhile, I got lectured for wanting independence. Especially after I joined ROTC. "You're too stubborn to be a wife," my father told me once when I was 21. "Now you want to play soldier too." That sentence stayed with me longer than I care to admit. Not because it hurt at the time. Because part of me spent decades trying to prove him wrong. The strange thing is, military life suited me better than family life ever did. The Navy made sense. Work hard, tell the truth, protect the people beside you, earn your place. Simple. Families weren't simple. Especially mine. Over the years, I missed birthdays, anniversaries, funerals, and holidays because of deployments. The further my career advanced, the colder my relationship with my parents became. My promotions irritated my father instead of impressing him. By the time I made commander, he'd stopped asking questions altogether. But Aunt Margaret never stopped calling. Sometimes from hospital rooms. Sometimes after hurricanes. Sometimes because she was lonely. And sometimes because she was scared. Especially during the last few years. "I think Richard's hiding things from me," she whispered once during a call while I was stationed in Bahrain. I sat alone in my quarters at nearly midnight listening to her shaky breathing over the phone. What kind of things? Money, papers, I don't know anymore. I urged her to see an attorney. She promised she would. I didn't know then how serious things had become. Back in the courtroom, Judge Holloway slowly lowered the letter onto his desk. "Counselors," he said carefully, "we are going to pause these proceedings temporarily." Dad stood immediately. "On what grounds?" The judge looked irritated now. "On the grounds that this document appears to substantially alter ownership claims connected to the Bennett estate holdings." Mom leaned forward sharply. "That's impossible." Judge Holloway removed his glasses. "No, Mrs. Bennett. Impossible would be pretending this letter doesn't exist." Daniel finally put down his phone. I could feel all three of them staring at me now like I'd somehow tricked them. But I hadn't tricked anyone. I barely understood what was happening myself. My attorney, Susan Mercer, touched my arm gently. "Claire," she whispered, "did you know about this?" I shook my head. Not fully. Margaret had mailed me the sealed envelope 2 weeks before she died with strict instructions not to open it unless the estate went to court. That was all. Dad suddenly pointed at me across the aisle. "She manipulated an old woman," he snapped. The accusation hit harder than I expected. Not because it was true. Because even after everything, some part of me still hated disappointing him. Susan stood immediately. "Your Honor." But I interrupted her. For the first time that day, I spoke directly to my father. "No," I said quietly. "I spent 30 years protecting people. Margaret was one of them." The room went silent again. Dad stared at me like he didn't recognize the person speaking. Maybe he didn't. Truthfully, sometimes I didn't either. Judge Holloway cleared his throat. "This court will reconvene tomorrow morning pending review of these documents and associated financial records." The gavel struck. People began standing. But my parents remained frozen in their seats, and as the storm outside finally broke into heavy rain against the courthouse windows, I realized something strange for the very first time in my life. I wasn't afraid of them anymore. The rain was still coming down hard when I walked out of the courthouse that afternoon. Florida rain has a way of swallowing sound. Cars hissed through puddles along Main Street, thunder rolled somewhere out over the Gulf, and people hurried under umbrellas without looking at each other for very long. Sarasota tourists usually loved the sunshine version of Florida. The real Florida, the wet heat, the storms, the mold creeping up old buildings, the loneliness tucked behind retirement communities was something else entirely. I stood under the courthouse awning for a moment, breathing slowly. My attorney, Susan Mercer, came out beside me carrying 2 thick folders against her chest. Well, she said that was one hell of a surprise. I let out a tired breath. "You're telling me?" Susan had handled elder law and estate disputes in Sarasota for almost 30 years. Mid-60s, sharp as broken glass silver hair cut short enough to mean business. Margaret trusted her completely, which was the only reason I trusted her too. "You really didn't know what was in that letter?" she asked carefully. "Number." "You had no idea Margaret transferred ownership protections." "I knew she was worried," I said, "that's all." Susan studied me quietly for a second, then nodded like she believed me. Because she did. Unlike my family, Susan understood something important about people my age. Most of us are too tired for games. By 62, you either tell the truth or you spend your whole life buried under the weight of lies. "I'll call you tonight after I review the trust documents," she said. "But Claire..."
"What?"
"You may want to prepare yourself. I think your aunt was hiding far more than anyone realized." That didn't surprise me nearly as much as it should have. Because the truth was, Margaret had been frightened for years. I just hadn't fully understood why. Back at my condo near Venice Beach, I changed out of my uniform, slowly hanging each piece carefully the way military habits teach you to do after decades. Some routines never leave your bones. Outside, palm trees bent sharply in the storm winds. I poured myself coffee even though it was already after 5 o'clock. At my age, caffeine after dinner was usually a mistake, but sleep wasn't coming anyway. The condo felt too quiet. That's one thing people never warn you about retirement. Silence gets louder. During my Navy years, there was always noise somewhere: engines, radios, announcements, helicopters, footsteps in corridors at 3 in the morning. Then suddenly one day you're home alone listening to your refrigerator hum. I carried the coffee mug to the living room and stared at the old framed photo sitting beside the television. Margaret and me. Taken 15 years earlier after my promotion ceremony in Norfolk. She had one arm around my shoulders and was grinning proudly at the camera while I stood there awkwardly in dress whites. "You look terrified," she'd laughed afterward. "I hate attention." "Well, too bad," she'd said. "You earned it." I touched the edge of the frame gently. Margaret was the only person in my family who ever said things like that to me. About an hour later, Susan called. I answered immediately. "Sit down," she said without preamble. I am sitting. Good, because this gets complicated. That's how the next 2 hours began. Piece by piece, Susan explained what the judge had discovered. Years earlier, back in 1998, Margaret had quietly established a protected property trust connected to her rental holdings. Not public knowledge. Barely even visible, unless someone knew exactly where to look. And according to the language inside that trust, operational authority transferred automatically to me under certain conditions. Conditions Margaret apparently believed had now been met. I rubbed my forehead slowly. This doesn't make sense. "It makes perfect sense," Susan replied. "Your aunt didn't trust your father." Hearing it stated so plainly hurt more than I expected. Not because it sounded impossible. Because deep down I had known for years she was probably right. Susan continued carefully. "Claire, there's more." "Of course there is. We've uncovered irregular withdrawals tied to several properties over the last decade." I closed my eyes. "How bad?" "Potentially very bad." The room suddenly felt warmer. Susan lowered her voice. Margaret documented concerns that Richard and Daniel were diverting rental income. For a few seconds, neither of us spoke. Finally, I asked, did Margaret know for certain? She suspected enough to start gathering records. My stomach tightened. Because suddenly dozens of old conversations began replaying in my head. Margaret calling me worried about missing invoices. Margaret confused about maintenance costs. Margaret crying once after Daniel yelled at her over repairs. At the time I thought it was family tension. Now I wondered if it had been something far uglier. "You still there?" Susan asked. "Yes. There's something else you need to know before tomorrow." I braced myself. "The court accountant found evidence that you personally covered multiple property tax shortages over the years." I blinked. "What?" "Wire transfers from overseas accounts linked to your Navy payroll." Now I understood. Margaret. She must have documented every time I sent money to help her. I leaned back against the couch, slowly exhausted all at once. Over the years, I'd wired her money quietly whenever emergencies happened: roof repairs after hurricanes, plumbing failures, insurance gaps, overdue taxes once or twice. Not because I expected anything in return. Because she needed help. That was it. But I never told my parents. Especially my father. Richard Bennett believed helping family financially made people weak. Unless Daniel needed help. Then somehow it became protecting the future. Funny how those rules changed, depending on which child he was talking about. After hanging up with Susan, I sat alone in the dark for a long time, listening to the storm outside. Eventually, my phone buzzed again. "Daniel." I almost ignored it. Almost. What I answered. His voice came sharp immediately. "What the hell did you do?" "Good evening to you too." "You blindsided Dad in court." "No," I said calmly. "Margaret did." "You manipulated her." I laughed softly then. Not because anything was funny. Because some accusations become ridiculous after enough years. "Daniel," I said quietly, "when was the last time you even visited Margaret without asking for something?" Silence. Then anger. "You think you're better than us because you wore a uniform." "No," I replied. "I think I kept my promises better." That hit him. I could hear it. "You abandoned this family for 30 years. The old accusation. The familiar one." I looked around my empty condo at the photographs from deployments, retirement ceremonies, Navy friends now dead or scattered across the country. "Funny," I said softly. "I spent 30 years serving people who treated me with more respect than my own family ever did." Daniel cursed under his breath. Then he hung up. I set the phone down carefully. Outside, thunder rattled the windows, and for the first time I allowed myself to wonder exactly how much Margaret had been protecting me from all these years. The next morning, the courthouse looked different. Not physically. Emotionally. Word had spread overnight. By the time I entered the courtroom, reporters were already gathered near the entrance, whispering about trust fraud investigations and hidden property transfers. Dad looked furious. Mom looked frightened. Daniel looked exhausted. And sitting on the clerk's table near the judge's bench were 4 large cardboard archive boxes filled with financial records. Judge Holloway entered quietly. No small talk this time. He adjusted his glasses, glanced toward my parents, then toward me, and said the words that truly began unraveling my family. After reviewing preliminary evidence, he announced this court has serious concerns regarding possible financial misconduct connected to the Bennett estate. My father stood abruptly. This is outrageous. But the judge didn't even look at him. Instead, he opened the first file from the accountant's box. And everything started falling apart. My father had spent his entire life believing confidence could overpower truth. That strategy worked surprisingly well for him over the years. Until the accountants arrived. By 10 o'clock that morning, the courtroom felt less like a probate hearing and more like a slow-moving disaster nobody could stop. Thick binders covered the tables. Bank statements, repair invoices, tax records, refinancing agreements, all stacked in neat piles while reporters scribbled notes from the back row. Judge Holloway looked exhausted already. So did I. Dad, however, still looked angry more than worried. That was typical Richard Bennett behavior. He treated every problem like an insult instead of a warning. Daniel sat beside him, tapping one nervous foot against the floor. Mom kept whispering things under her breath that nobody answered. I sat quietly next to Susan, watching 20 years of family lies begin surfacing one page at a time. Your Honor, the forensic accountant said carefully, our preliminary review indicates substantial irregularities involving several Bennett properties between 2009 and 2024. Dad scoffed loudly. Irregularities. That's a dramatic word for bookkeeping errors. The accountant didn't react. Older professionals usually don't. He simply adjusted his glasses and continued. We identified repeated transfers from tenant operating accounts into unrelated private business accounts connected to Daniel Bennett. Now every head in the courtroom turned toward my brother. Daniel immediately straightened. That doesn't prove anything. The accountant opened another folder. It also appears multiple maintenance reserves were depleted while tenants were informed repairs could not be afforded. A cold heaviness settled in my chest. Because suddenly I remembered dozens of conversations with Margaret over the years. The leaking roof in Bradenton. The broken air conditioning units during August heat. The elderly tenant whose plumbing failed after a hurricane. Margaret always sounded embarrassed asking me for help. Just temporary, she'd promise. I'll pay you back. I never let her. But now I finally understood why the shortages never seemed to end. Judge Holloway looked toward Daniel. Mr. Bennett, do you wish to respond? Daniel glanced immediately at Dad before speaking. That tiny movement told me everything. It was complicated, Daniel muttered. Dad leaned forward sharply. My son managed those properties under extremely difficult market conditions. Susan finally spoke. Interesting, because tax records show rising rental income during the same period. The courtroom went quiet again. My father's jaw tightened. That expression used to terrify me when I was young. By 62, it mostly made me sad. The accountant continued reviewing findings for nearly another hour. Unauthorized refinancing. Missing maintenance funds. Insurance discrepancies. Deferred repairs. And underneath all of it sat the same ugly truth nobody wanted to say aloud. Daniel had been draining money from the properties for years, while Dad protected him. At one point, Judge Holloway removed his glasses and rubbed his forehead slowly. How extensive are these losses? The accountant flipped several pages. Potentially several $1 million over time. Mom gasped softly. Daniel muttered, that's exaggerated. But nobody sounded convinced anymore. Especially not me. Because for the first time in my life, the math of my childhood suddenly made sense. The favoritism. The excuses. The endless rescuing. Dad wasn't just emotionally invested in Daniel. He was financially trapped in him. The realization hit harder than I expected. Susan leaned toward me quietly. "You okay?" I nodded once. But I wasn't. Because old memories kept surfacing whether I wanted them to or not. I remembered being 14 years old and standing in our Jacksonville kitchen while Dad yelled at me for denting the car bumper. "You don't pay attention," he snapped. Meanwhile, Daniel had crashed a motorcycle 6 months earlier and somehow gotten sympathy instead of punishment. I remembered graduating near the top of my ROTC class while Dad skipped the ceremony because Daniel had a tennis tournament. I remembered coming home from my first deployment and listening to my parents brag about Daniel's new boat for nearly 2 straight hours without asking me a single question about where I'd been. And somehow, despite all that, part of me still spent decades trying to earn their approval. That's the cruel thing about family. Even neglected children keep hoping eventually they'll be loved correctly. Around noon, the courtroom recessed briefly. I stepped outside into the humid Florida air hoping to clear my head. Instead, I found Mrs. Delgado waiting near the courthouse benches. For a moment, I didn't recognize her. Then she smiled softly. "Claire." My chest tightened instantly. Mrs. Elena Delgado had rented one of Margaret's duplex units for nearly 20 years. Widowed, retired school cafeteria worker, tiny woman with silver curls and tired eyes. I hugged her carefully. "What are you doing here?" "I heard about the hearing," she said. "I wanted to support you." Emotion caught me off guard. Because support was still something I never quite expected naturally. Mrs. Delgado squeezed my hand. "Your aunt loved you very much." I swallowed hard. I loved her too. She hesitated before speaking again. "There were times Margaret cried after Daniel visited." Anger flickered inside me. Not explosive anger. The slower kind older people carry quietly after years of disappointment. "What did he do?" Mrs. Delgado lowered her voice. "He pressured her about money. Sometimes she'd sit outside afterward shaking." That image nearly broke me. Margaret alone on those old concrete steps trying not to cry where tenants could see her. And I had been halfway around the world thinking phone calls were enough. Mrs. Delgado smiled sadly. "But she always said you protected people." I looked away toward the rain-darkened streets. "I tried." "No," she said gently, "you did." When court resumed, the atmosphere had changed. Even Dad looked less certain now. Then the accountant introduced the refinancing records, and everything became worse. Several property loans contain authorization signatures attributed to Margaret Bennett, he explained. Susan stood immediately. "We request forensic review of those signatures." Dad exploded. "This is insanity." Judge Holloway's voice hardened. "Sit down, Mr. Bennett." Dad remained standing another second too long before finally lowering himself into his chair. I watched him carefully then. Really watched him. And for the first time in my life I saw fear. Not anger. Fear. Daniel leaned toward him, whispering urgently. Dad shook his head sharply. The accountant continued. "One particular refinancing agreement from 2018 raises serious concerns regarding authenticity." Susan turned toward me quietly. "If those signatures were forged?" She didn't finish. She didn't need to. Forgery against an elderly woman in a trust dispute wasn't just unethical. It was criminal. Mom suddenly looked very small sitting there between them. Not innocent, but smaller. Older. Tired. That surprised me more than anything else that day. Because I had spent so many years viewing my parents as emotionally indestructible forces that I forgot age catches everyone eventually. Even proud people. Judge Holloway called another recess late that afternoon. As people stood and gathered papers, my father suddenly crossed the courtroom toward me. Susan moved immediately to intercept him, but I touched her arm lightly. "It's okay." Dad stopped only a few feet away. Up close, he looked older than I remembered. Deep lines around his mouth, thin patches in his hair, skin beginning to sag beneath his jaw. Time had finally reached him, too. "You think this makes you righteous?" he asked quietly. I met his eyes calmly. "Number. You're humiliating this family." The old accusation again. Family loyalty. Silence. Protection at any cost. I felt strangely calm suddenly. "You humiliated this family yourself," I said. His expression hardened. Then for one brief second something cracked underneath it. Not guilt, exactly. More like confusion. As if he genuinely couldn't understand how we arrived here. Maybe because people who spend decades justifying small dishonesties eventually lose track of where the line was originally supposed to be. Dad glanced around the courtroom filled with reporters, lawyers, and accountants. Then back at me. You always thought you were better than us. I shook my head slowly. No, I said quietly. I just learned how to survive without you. He stared at me for several long seconds, then walked away without another word. And as I watched him leave, I realized something painful. The strongest wound parents leave behind isn't hatred. It's the lifelong ache of never feeling chosen. The next morning, the courthouse parking lot was already crowded before sunrise. News vans lined the curb outside. Reporters stood under umbrellas drinking coffee from paper cups, while camera crews adjusted equipment in the damp Florida heat. Somewhere nearby, seagulls screamed over the harbor like they always did before storms. I sat alone inside my car for several minutes before going in. At my age, you learn the value of pausing before difficult things. Not avoiding them. Just breathing first. My hands rested on the steering wheel while I stared at the courthouse entrance. The reflection in the windshield showed a woman with tired eyes, silver threading through dark hair, and 30 years of military posture she still couldn't quite turn off. I barely recognized myself sometimes, not because I'd changed, because I'd spent so much of my life becoming whoever survival required. Finally, I picked up my coffee and walked inside. Courtroom 3 felt colder than usual that morning. Dad sat rigidly beside Daniel, jaw clenched hard enough to show through his cheeks. Mom avoided eye contact entirely. Susan leaned toward me quietly. You ready? No, I admitted. She nodded. Good. Only liars are ever completely ready for days like this. Judge Holloway entered promptly at 9. No delays. No pleasantries. He carried a thick folder in one hand and looked grim. After everyone settled, he opened the file slowly. This court has completed preliminary verification regarding the Bennett Family Property Trust established in 1998. The room became still instantly. Even reporters stopped moving. Judge Holloway adjusted his glasses. The trust appears legally valid and enforceable. Dad inhaled sharply beside me. Then came the sentence that truly shattered my family. If anything happens to me, the judge read aloud from Margaret's letter, all controlling ownership transfers immediately to Claire Bennett under the protected trust established in 1998. Gasps spread quietly through the courtroom. My own breath caught. Even hearing the words directly, I still struggled to absorb them. Margaret had done this 28 years earlier. 28. Back when I was still serving overseas regularly, back before Daniel's debt spiraled, back before the properties became battlegrounds. She had planned for this possibility decades ago. Dad stood abruptly. This is absurd. Judge Holloway didn't even look up. The trust further specifies that operational control bypasses any beneficiary shown to have financially exploited protected assets or elderly ownership. Daniel muttered something under his breath. Susan whispered, "That's why the letter changed everything." My father looked furious now. No, he snapped loudly. Margaret was manipulated. The judge finally looked at him. Mr. Bennett, 3 separate attorneys verified this trust over the years. Silence. Then the judge continued reading. The trust additionally prohibits displacement of tenants over age 65 without documented cause. Properties may not be converted into speculative luxury developments. I suddenly understood why Dad wanted control so badly. The land itself had become enormously valuable over time. Florida coastal property always does. Luxury developers had probably been circling those buildings for years like vultures. But Margaret protected them. Protected the tenants. Protected the community. And somehow protected me too. Judge Holloway lowered the papers carefully. In summary, Mrs. Margaret Bennett intentionally structured these holdings to remain affordable community housing under Claire Bennett's supervision. I felt every eye in the room turn toward me again. Not with suspicion this time. With curiosity. Maybe even respect. It felt unfamiliar. Daniel suddenly slammed both hands against the table. This is insane. The sound echoed sharply through the courtroom. Mom jumped. Dad grabbed Daniel's arm. "Sit down." "No," Daniel snapped. "You told me everything was handled." The words landed like a gunshot. Dad's face changed instantly. Not anger this time. Panic. Judge Holloway narrowed his eyes. "Mr. Bennett, are you suggesting prior awareness of disputed ownership conditions?" "No," Dad said quickly. "Of course not." But the damage was done. Daniel was unraveling. Years of pressure, debt, and entitlement were finally cracking open in public. "You said she'd never challenge us," Daniel hissed toward Dad. I stared at my brother quietly. For the first time, he didn't look spoiled. He looked scared. Truly scared. And beneath the fear sat something sadder. A man who had spent his whole life being rescued and therefore never learned how to stand on his own. The courtroom recessed briefly after noon. I stepped into the hallway near the vending machines, hoping for a few minutes alone. Instead, Mom followed me. "Claire." Her voice sounded smaller than I remembered. I turned slowly. Up close, she suddenly looked every bit of her 83 years. Carefully styled hair couldn't hide exhaustion anymore. Neither could pearls. Neither could pride. What I asked gently. She folded her hands tightly together. "You don't understand how hard things became." I almost laughed. Not cruelly. "Just tired." "Mom," I said quietly, "I spent most of my adult life deployed in war zones." "That's not what I mean." "Then what do you mean?" Tears suddenly filled her eyes. Real tears. Not dramatic ones. "Your father was trying to save the family." The sentence hit me harder than anger would have. Because somewhere deep down I knew she believed it. That's how families survive dysfunction for decades. People convince themselves harmful choices are acts of protection. I leaned against the wall slowly. "By stealing from Margaret." Mom looked away. No one thought it would go this far. There it was. The truth underneath most disasters. Nobody plans for the collapse. They just keep justifying small wrong decisions until eventually those decisions become a life. I studied my mother carefully. "Did you know Daniel was taking money?" Silence. Then softly, "I knew your father kept helping him." Not the same answer. And we both knew it. I closed my eyes briefly. "When did you stop seeing me as your daughter?" I asked before I could stop myself. Mom looked stunned. "Claire." "No," I said quietly. "I genuinely want to know." She stared down at the courthouse tile floor. "You were always so distant." The old misunderstanding again. As if independence and emotional neglect were the same thing. "I was stationed overseas," I said. "You never needed us." That one nearly broke my heart. Because finally, after 60 years, I understood the terrible logic of my family. Daniel received love because he stayed dependent. I lost it because I learned how to survive alone. Mom's voice trembled. "Your father thought Daniel needed more support." I nodded slowly. "And what did you think I needed?" She opened her mouth, then closed it again. Because she didn't know. Maybe she never had. Back inside the courtroom, proceedings resumed quietly. Then the forensic handwriting specialist testified. And the room changed again. After reviewing multiple refinancing documents, the specialist concluded one of Margaret's signatures had significant indicators of forgery. Mom covered her mouth. Daniel stared straight ahead, motionless. Dad looked furious. But underneath the anger now sat defeat. The kind older people recognize immediately. The moment someone realizes consequences have finally outrun excuses. Judge Holloway spoke carefully. "This court will refer potential criminal findings to state investigators pending full review." The reporters practically exploded into motion. Questions flew immediately once proceedings adjourned. Cameras turned toward Dad. Toward Daniel. Toward me. I slipped quietly out a side hallway before anyone could stop me. Outside, the rain had finally ended. The late afternoon sun broke weakly through the clouds, turning the wet pavement gold. I stood there alone, breathing in damp salt air from the Gulf. And for the first time since this nightmare began, I cried. Not because I'd won. Because I suddenly understood how deeply broken my family had always been. Aunt Margaret saw it decades ago. She built that trust because she knew eventually someone would have to stop the damage. And somehow, despite everything, she believed that person was me. By the 5th day of hearings, my father looked 10 years older. Pride ages people faster than hard work ever does. The sharp confidence he carried into court that first morning had started collapsing around the edges. His ties hung looser now. His shoulders sagged when he thought nobody was watching. Even his voice sounded thinner. Daniel looked worse. The newspapers had begun publishing details from the investigation, and Sarasota being Sarasota word spread quickly among golf clubs, restaurants, church groups, and retirement communities. Older towns remember scandals differently than younger places do. News travels slowly at first, then suddenly everybody knows. And everybody talks. That Thursday morning I stopped at a small diner near the courthouse before proceedings began. Same diner Margaret loved for years. Red vinyl booths, cheap coffee, waitresses who called everyone honey whether they knew your name or not. I sat alone near the window watching traffic crawl through the wet streets while stirring powdered creamer into my coffee. Then someone touched my shoulder gently. "Commander Bennett." I turned. An older man stood there holding a Navy veteran cap in both hands. Mid-70s maybe, thin frame, weathered skin. "I hope I'm not bothering you," he said. "Not at all." He smiled awkwardly. I rented from Margaret for 13 years over in Bradenton. Recognition flickered. "Mr. Harlan." His face brightened immediately. "You remember me?" "Of course I do." Years earlier, after Hurricane Ian damaged several units, Margaret called me frantic because Mr. Harlan's roof had partially collapsed. I spent 2 straight nights coordinating emergency repairs remotely from Bahrain because local contractors were overwhelmed. At the time, I barely thought about it. That's just what you do when someone needs help. Mr. Harlan sat carefully across from me. "I just wanted to thank you." "For what?" He laughed softly. "For treating us like human beings." Emotion tightened unexpectedly in my throat. Older people understand the weight of simple dignity better than anyone. Mr. Harlan lowered his voice. "Daniel tried raising rents 3 different times after Margaret got sick." I stared quietly. "He told us luxury developers were interested," Mr. Harlan continued. "Said seniors like us were holding property values back." Anger moved through me slowly then. Not hot anger. Cold anger. The kind that settles deep after too many years of watching greed disguise itself as business. Mr. Harlan shook his head sadly. "Margaret always stopped him." I looked down at my coffee cup. "She protected people." "Yes," he said softly, "so did you." That sentence stayed with me all morning. Back in court, the atmosphere had shifted completely. The reporters no longer chased me. They chased my father. Judge Holloway entered carrying additional financial summaries, while state investigators sat quietly near the rear benches taking notes. Dad noticed them immediately. His hands started trembling slightly. That frightened me more than I expected. Because no matter how complicated family becomes, seeing your father afraid still does something to your heart. The proceedings focused heavily on Daniel that day. Credit card debts, casino withdrawals, luxury vehicle leases, failed business investments. One after another, the records painted the same ugly picture. Daniel had been drowning financially for years. And Dad kept trying to save him, at everyone else's expense. Finally, Judge Holloway looked directly at Daniel. "Mr. Bennett, why did you continue borrowing against these properties?" Daniel laughed bitterly. "You really want the honest answer?" "Yes." My brother leaned back slowly in his chair. "Because my father always told me family would protect me." Silence. The words hit harder than shouting ever could. Daniel looked toward Dad. "You fixed every mistake I ever made." Dad's jaw tightened. "I was helping my son." "No," Daniel snapped suddenly. "You were keeping me weak." The room went still. Even the reporters stopped typing. And there it was at last. The truth nobody in our family had ever spoken aloud. Favoritism doesn't only damage the neglected child. It destroys the favored one too. Daniel rubbed both hands over his face shakily. "I never learned consequences," he admitted quietly. Mom started crying beside him. Real crying this time. Not polished tears. Old woman tears. The kind that come from finally seeing damage clearly after years of denial. I watched them silently from across the courtroom, feeling something strange and uncomfortable. Not victory. Grief. Because revenge stories sound satisfying when you're younger. But real life at 62 feels different. Watching your family collapse doesn't heal old wounds. It just proves they were real all along. Around midday, court recessed briefly again. This time, Susan pulled me aside near the clerk's office. "You holding up?" "I think so." She studied me carefully. "You know you don't have to keep wearing armor anymore." I almost smiled. "Military habit." "No," Susan said gently, "emotional habit." That one landed. Because she was right. I had spent my entire life learning composure. In the Navy, composure keeps people alive. In families, sometimes it just keeps people distant. Susan handed me another folder. Margaret left additional instructions regarding the properties. I opened it slowly. Inside were handwritten notes in Margaret's shaky cursive. Affordable rent protections, veteran housing assistance, emergency hurricane funds for elderly tenants, community meal programs during storm evacuations. I stared at the pages quietly. This wasn't just property management. It was stewardship. Margaret hadn't spent decades building investments. She'd spent decades building stability for vulnerable people. And somehow she trusted me to continue it. I suddenly felt the weight of that responsibility more than the money itself. "Why me?" I whispered. Susan answered softly, "Because she knew character matters more than charm." Back inside court, the final testimony of the afternoon focused on forged refinancing signatures. The handwriting expert confirmed again that Margaret likely did not authorize at least one major loan agreement. State investigators requested copies immediately. Dad looked physically ill now. Then something happened I never expected. As proceedings adjourned, Dad stood too quickly. His face drained pale. One hand grabbed the table edge sharply. Richard, Mom gasped. The courtroom erupted instantly. Dad staggered once before collapsing backward into his chair, clutching his chest. Everything blurred for a moment after that. Paramedics, reporters shouting, Daniel yelling for space, Mom crying uncontrollably, and me, moving automatically. Military training never really leaves you. I reached Dad before anyone else did. "Breathe," I ordered firmly while checking his pulse. His terrified eyes locked onto mine. For one strange second he looked less like my father, and more like an old, frightened man who suddenly realized his body could fail him. "Claire," he whispered weakly. "It's okay," I said automatically. The paramedics arrived seconds later. They stabilized him quickly while asking questions. Possible cardiac episode. Elevated stress. Transport recommended immediately. As they wheeled him toward the ambulance outside, reporters swarmed the courthouse steps like vultures. Daniel shoved cameras away angrily. Mom looked completely shattered. And I stood there in the humid Florida evening feeling exhausted beyond words. Not triumphant. Just tired. Because somewhere between childhood and old age, most revenge fantasies quietly die. What remains instead is the painful realization that damaged people often damage others without fully understanding what they're doing. That doesn't excuse the harm, but it changes the shape of anger. Late that night, after the courthouse emptied and the rain finally stopped, Mom called me from the hospital. Her voice sounded small. "Your father wants to see you." I stared out at the dark Gulf waters from my condo balcony for a long moment before answering. Then finally asked the question I never thought I would. Why? I didn't go to the hospital that night. At least not immediately. Instead, I sat on my condo balcony listening to waves roll softly against the dark shoreline, while Mom's question kept circling inside my head. "Your father wants to see you." For most of my life, hearing that sentence would have filled me with anxiety. Usually it meant criticism, disappointment, some fresh reminder that I had somehow failed to become the daughter my father wanted. But now things were different. Now Richard Bennett was 86 years old, lying in a cardiac unit with state investigators reviewing forged financial documents connected to his family business. Age strips power from people in strange ways, especially men who built their identities around control. Around midnight, I finally drove to Sarasota Memorial Hospital. The fluorescent lights in hospital corridors always feel the same no matter where you are in America, cold, sleepless, and strangely timeless. I passed nurses sipping coffee at stations, exhausted family members slumped in waiting room chairs, muted televisions glowing overhead with weather reports nobody was truly watching. Mom stood when she saw me approach. Her eyes were swollen red. "He's awake," she whispered. I nodded once. Neither of us knew how to behave around each other anymore. Maybe we never had. She touched my arm awkwardly before I entered the room. And suddenly I realized something heartbreaking. My mother was afraid of me now. Not physically. Morally. As if truth itself had become frightening. Dad looked smaller in the hospital bed than I'd ever seen him. Machines beeped softly around him while rain tapped against the windows again outside. Florida storms never seemed to fully leave this week. He turned his head slowly when I entered. For several seconds, neither of us spoke. Then he gave a weak half-laugh. "Well," he muttered, "this is humiliating." I pulled a chair closer and sat carefully. "You're alive," I said, "that's what matters." Dad studied me quietly. "Still wearing emotional armor even now. I suppose you'd know about survival better than me." The comment almost sounded respectful. That alone felt strange. I folded my hands together. "What did you want to say?" He looked away toward the rain-darkened window. "I don't know where things went wrong." I could have answered that question 100 different ways. Instead, I asked one of my own. "When did you decide Daniel mattered more than me?" Dad closed his eyes briefly. "That's not fair." "No," I said softly. What wasn't fair was spending 60 years pretending I didn't notice. Silence filled the room again. Hospital silence feels heavier somehow. "Older." Dad swallowed hard before speaking. "You were always stronger." I stared at him. There it was. The explanation beneath everything. "You thought strength meant I needed less love." He rubbed tired fingers against the blanket. "Your brother struggled." And I didn't. "You handled things." The old misunderstanding again? Competence mistaken for emotional invulnerability. It happens in families all the time. Especially to daughters. I leaned back slowly in the chair. "You know what military life taught me?" I asked quietly. Dad looked over. That people who seem strongest are usually carrying the heaviest loads. Something shifted in his face then. Not defensiveness. Recognition. Painfully late recognition. He looked suddenly very tired. "I never understood you," he admitted. The honesty startled me. Not because it fixed anything. Because it was probably the truest thing he'd ever said to me. Rainwater streaked down the hospital window behind him while monitors beeped softly beside the bed. Finally, he asked the question I think had haunted him all week. "Do you hate me?" I thought about it carefully before answering. At 62, I've learned people deserve truthful answers more than dramatic ones. "No," I said softly, "I grieved you." Dad's eyes filled immediately. And suddenly I saw it happen. The moment my father finally understood that emotional neglect leaves wounds just as real as cruelty. Maybe worse sometimes. Because neglected children grow up believing they simply weren't worth choosing. Dad turned his face away slightly. "I thought pushing you made you stronger." "No," I said gently, "the Navy made me stronger, you just made me lonely." He covered his eyes with one hand then. And for the first time in my entire life I watched my father cry. Not loudly. Not theatrically. Quiet old man tears. The kind people cry when they finally see themselves clearly. I sat there silently while years of anger softened into something sadder and more human. Because age changes revenge too. When you're young, you want people who hurt you to suffer. When you're older, sometimes you just wish they had loved you better while there was still time. After a while, Dad lowered his hand again. "I resented you," he admitted hoarsely. That surprised me enough to still my breathing. "Why?" "Because you didn't need me." The sentence echoed painfully through the room. There it was again. Dependence mistaken for love. Independence mistaken for rejection. Dad looked exhausted now. "You built a life without this family," he whispered, "and I didn't know where I fit in it." I shook my head slowly. "You could have fit anywhere," I said. "You just kept choosing Daniel instead." The truth hung between us quietly. Dad didn't deny it. Because finally even he couldn't anymore. The next afternoon I drove to the Bradenton properties alone. I needed to see them again outside courtrooms and legal files. The buildings weren't fancy. Faded paint, old railings, storm shutters still stacked near entrances from hurricane season. But they were clean. Stable. Lived in. Mrs. Delgado waved when she spotted me walking the property grounds. "So many people are worried," she said softly. "About what?" "That developers will still come." I looked around slowly. An elderly veteran watered tomato plants beside one porch. 2 widows sat talking beneath a palm tree. Someone played old country music softly through an open screen door. Community. That's what Margaret protected. Not buildings. People. And suddenly I understood my responsibility much more clearly. Not revenge. Stewardship. Later that evening, Daniel called unexpectedly. His voice sounded hollow. "My wife left." I closed my eyes briefly. "I'm sorry." "No," he said quietly, "you're not." The truth was complicated. I didn't want his life destroyed. But I also couldn't pretend consequences weren't deserved. "She said I've spent my whole life acting like somebody else would always save me," he admitted. Neither of us spoke for several seconds. Finally, he laughed bitterly. "She was probably right." I stared out toward the Gulf again. "You can still change," I said quietly. "Can I?" The sadness in his voice startled me. Because beneath all the arrogance and entitlement, Daniel sounded lost. Like a little boy who never learned how to become an adult properly. And maybe that's exactly what he was. Before hanging up, he said something I never expected to hear from him. "I think you were the only honest person in this family." After the call ended, I sat alone in the dark, thinking about how much damage favoritism leaves behind, not only for the ignored child, but for the favored one too. Then my phone buzzed again. A text from Mom. "Your father wants to apologize." I stared at the screen for a very long time. Because some words arrive decades too late. But sometimes they still matter anyway. 3 weeks later, the courtroom was finally quiet. No reporters crowded the steps anymore. No television vans blocked the parking spaces. The scandal had already begun fading into the endless stream of newer headlines Americans move on to every day. That's another thing age teaches you. The world rarely pauses for personal heartbreak. Life just keeps moving. By then, most of the legal matters had been settled. The state investigation into the forged refinancing documents was still ongoing, but Dad's attorneys negotiated agreements that prevented criminal prosecution in exchange for full financial restitution, property oversight cooperation, and permanent withdrawal from trust management. Judge Holloway approved the final structure on a rainy Tuesday morning. The properties would remain protected community housing under the Margaret Bennett Trust. Affordable rent caps stayed in place. Senior tenant protections expanded. Emergency hurricane funds were fully restored. And several units would now be reserved specifically for low-income veterans. When the judge finalized the paperwork, he looked directly at me. "Ms. Bennett," he said carefully, "your aunt chose wisely." I didn't know how to answer that. Because even now I still wasn't entirely sure I deserved the faith Margaret placed in me. Outside the courthouse, Susan hugged me tightly. "You did good," she said. "No," I replied softly. "Margaret did." Susan smiled sadly. Sometimes the best people leave their courage behind for someone else to carry. That stayed with me. A week later, we held Margaret's memorial service near the Gulf. Nothing extravagant. That would have embarrassed her. Just folding chairs beneath a covered pavilion overlooking the water, coffee in cardboard containers, trays of sandwiches from a local deli she loved, and about 80 people whose lives she'd quietly touched over the years. Tenants, veterans, neighbors, church friends, maintenance workers, people society often overlooks. The weather turned strangely beautiful that afternoon. Warm breeze, pale sunlight breaking through clouds, pelicans drifting low across the water. I wore civilian clothes for once. Simple navy slacks and a white blouse. No medals. No rank. Just Claire. Mrs. Delgado hugged me first. Then Mr. Harlan. Then half the tenants lined up to share stories about Margaret helping with medicine costs, groceries, after hurricanes, rent delays during illnesses, rides to doctor appointments. Small acts. But older people understand small acts are what hold communities together. Daniel arrived late. He looked thinner now, quieter. Real life had finally reached him. He approached awkwardly while people mingled beneath the pavilion. "I almost didn't come," he admitted. "I'm glad you did." He shoved his hands into his pockets. I started working with the maintenance crews. I nodded slowly. I heard? Turns out Daniel had taken a full-time job handling repairs across several trust properties after the hearings ended. Not management. Actual work. Plumbing calls. Storm prep. Roof inspections. At first I assumed it was temporary desperation. But maybe it wasn't. I'm learning things, he said quietly. Like what? He gave a tired laugh, like how hard normal people work. There was no arrogance left in him when he said it. Only embarrassment. Growth often sounds like embarrassment in the beginning. Before I could answer, Mom approached carefully. And behind her came Dad. He walked slower now. The hospital stay changed him physically. Age suddenly sat heavier on his shoulders, and the old forcefulness in his posture had softened into something more fragile. Consequence leaves visible marks eventually. Conversations around us gradually quieted as people noticed him approaching. Dad looked nervous. I honestly couldn't remember ever seeing my father nervous before. Then he surprised everyone, including me. He turned toward the small crowd gathered beneath the pavilion and cleared his throat. I need to say something. The breeze moved softly through the palm trees nearby while everyone waited. Dad looked out toward the gulf for a moment before speaking again. I spent most of my life believing providing money made me a good father. His voice trembled slightly. I was wrong. Complete silence settled over the pavilion. Even the waves seemed quieter somehow. Dad looked toward Daniel first. I protected my son from consequences until he never learned responsibility. Daniel lowered his eyes. Then Dad turned toward me. And suddenly I was 10 years old again for one terrible second, waiting to hear whether I had disappointed him. But this time was different. I confused control with love, he said hoarsely, and by the time I realized it, I almost lost my daughter forever. Emotion tightened painfully in my throat. Dad swallowed hard before continuing. Claire spent her life serving other people while I spent years treating her like she owed me proof of her worth. Mom began crying softly beside him. So today Dad whispered, I want to say publicly what I should have said decades ago. He looked directly at me then. You became the strongest and most honorable person in this family. I couldn't speak. For 60 years I imagined hearing words like that. And somehow, now that they finally came, they felt less victorious than heartbreaking. Because no apology returns lost time. Still, some wounds heal crooked instead of clean. And maybe that has to be enough sometimes. Dad stepped closer slowly. I'm sorry, Claire. Not polished. Not perfect. But real. And after a long moment I hugged him. The crowd quietly looked away, giving us privacy older generations understand without being asked for. Dad's shoulders shook slightly while he held on to me. Not because everything was fixed. Because truth finally had nowhere left to hide. Later that evening, after everyone left, I walked alone along the shoreline behind the pavilion. The Florida sunset stretched gold across the gulf while waves rolled gently over wet sand. I thought about Margaret, about the Navy, about all the years I spent believing strength meant enduring loneliness silently. Maybe I was wrong about that too. Inheritance isn't really about property, or money, or courtrooms. It's about what people leave behind inside other human beings. Margaret left compassion. The Navy left discipline. My parents, despite all the pain, left lessons too. And maybe growing older means accepting that even damaged families can still leave something worth carrying forward. If this story touched something in your own life, whether you were the overlooked child, the favored one, or the parent who wishes they had done better, I hope you remember this. Love given conditionally leaves scars that last for decades, but honesty, accountability, and kindness still have the power to heal what pride nearly destroys. And if there's someone you still need to speak honestly with while time allows it, don't wait too long. Thank you for listening to my story. The house is sold, you're homeless now. My mother-in-law said it like she was announcing the weather. Calm, cold, satisfied. She stood beside my husband on our front porch, holding a stack of divorce papers against her chest, while the late afternoon Colorado wind pushed strands of silver hair across her face. Daniel wouldn't even look me in the eye. I remember staring at both of them from the driveway, still holding my purse, still smiling from what had happened less than an hour earlier. $7 million. My grandmother Eleanor had left me $7 million and her estate in Aspen. I had spent the entire drive home crying happy tears behind the wheel like some foolish teenage girl. I kept imagining Daniel lifting me off the ground when I told him. I imagined us finally breathing again after years of financial stress. Instead, my husband stood on the porch beside his mother like a stranger waiting to evict a tenant. "The movers already came," Patricia continued. "Your things are in storage." I blinked slowly. "What?" Daniel finally spoke, but his voice sounded rehearsed. "It's over, Claire. Over. 27 years of marriage reduced to 2 words spoken by a man who once drove 6 hours through a snowstorm just to bring me soup when I had pneumonia." I looked past them toward the house. Our house. Or at least the place I had believed was ours. The flower pots I planted in spring were gone. The porch swing Daniel built 10 years earlier was missing, too. Even the curtains had changed. That's when I realized this hadn't happened suddenly. This had been planned. Carefully. Quietly. Probably for weeks. Maybe longer. Patricia stepped down one porch stair and held out the papers toward me. "You should sign while things are still civil." Civil. I almost laughed. Instead, I asked the question that mattered most. "When were you going to tell me?" Daniel rubbed his forehead like I was exhausting him. "Claire, don't make this harder than it has to be." Harder. I thought about the leather folder still sitting in my car containing the copy of Eleanor's will. I thought about the attorney shaking my hand that morning. I thought about the way my grandmother had smiled during her final weeks whenever Patricia's name came up. Now suddenly that smile made sense. Patricia folded her arms. "You'll land on your feet, women always do." There was something almost impressive about how cruel she could sound while pretending to be practical. I met that woman when I was 34 years old. She hated me before she even knew me. Not openly, of course. Patricia Whitmore was too polished for that. Too country club refined. Too experienced at delivering insults wrapped inside compliments. "Oh, Claire, you're prettier than Daniel's usual type. You're so brave to wear your hair short. You've always been so independent. Some men don't like that forever." Little cuts. Tiny poisons. Year after year. And Daniel always defended her. "She doesn't mean it that way." That had become the anthem of our marriage. Patricia looked toward the street impatiently. "You really should leave before the buyers arrive." Buyers. The word floated strangely in my head. Then Daniel finally looked directly at me. "The house sold 3 days ago." 3 days. 3 days earlier, I had been sitting beside my grandmother's hospital bed holding her hand while she struggled to breathe. 3 days earlier, my husband was apparently selling our home behind my back. Something inside me should have shattered right then. But strangely, it didn't. Because at that exact moment, another memory surfaced. 3 months earlier, Grandma Eleanor sitting quietly at her kitchen table in Aspen while snow fell outside the windows. "Never let other people rush you into signing papers," she had told me. I remembered laughing softly. "Grandma, you sound paranoid." "No," she said calmly, "I sound old." At the time, I thought she was talking about ordinary legal precautions. Now I wasn't so sure. Patricia interrupted my thoughts by shoving the papers closer toward me. "You can sign now or later. Makes no difference to us." Us. Not Daniel. Us. That told me everything. This wasn't a marriage ending. This was an extraction. A removal. And Patricia had orchestrated it. Daniel finally sighed. "The house was under my name, Claire. Legally, there's nothing you can do." That sentence almost made me smile immediately. Almost. Instead, I asked quietly, "You sold it already?" "Yes." "And finalized everything?" Daniel nodded once. Patricia smirked. "You always were too trusting." There it was. The truth. Not anger. Not heartbreak. Contempt. They thought I was weak. Simple. Manageable. The funny thing is, I probably had been. At least until that morning. At least until Eleanor's attorney slid those documents across the desk. At least until I learned my grandmother had spent years preparing for something I didn't yet fully understand. A strange calm settled over me. The kind of calm people get right before a car crash. Or right after one. I looked up at the porch. At my husband. At the woman who spent nearly 3 decades trying to erase me from her son's life. Then I smiled. A real smile. Daniel frowned immediately. "What's so funny?" I glanced toward the stack of papers in Patricia's hands. Then toward the house behind them. Toward the house Daniel proudly believed he had sold. And softly, almost gently, I said, "Actually, the house you sold belonged to." Neither of them spoke. The wind moved through the trees above us. Patricia's expression shifted slightly for the first time all afternoon. Confusion. Just a flicker. But enough. And standing there in the driveway with the sun dropping behind the mountains, I suddenly realized something important. For the first time in 27 years, I wasn't the one about to lose everything. Patricia's smile disappeared first. Not completely. Just enough for me to notice. The confidence around her eyes tightened slightly while Daniel stared at me like he was trying to solve a math problem in his head. "What does that mean?" he asked. I didn't answer immediately. Honestly, I wasn't entirely sure myself. Not yet. But I knew enough. And more importantly, they didn't know what I knew. That changed everything. Patricia recovered quickly, of course. Women like her always did. She gave a short, dismissive laugh and handed the divorce papers back to Daniel. "Oh, please," she said, "don't start with dramatic nonsense." But Daniel kept staring at me, because after 27 years together he knew my face. He knew when I was bluffing, and this wasn't bluffing. I slowly walked past them toward the porch steps. Patricia immediately moved sideways to block me. "You can't go inside." I looked at her calmly. "My coat is still in there. We'll ship it." Ship it. Like I was already dead. For one brief second, anger flashed hot through my chest. Not because of the house, not even because of Daniel. Because of humiliation. Because they had planned this carefully enough to pack my belongings before I even came home from my grandmother's will reading. Daniel finally spoke again. "Claire, maybe we should talk privately." Patricia snapped her head toward him immediately. "About what?" There it was again. Control. She didn't even try to hide it anymore. I suddenly remembered something Grandma Eleanor once told me while we sat together on her aspen porch drinking tea. When a man stops thinking for himself, watch the woman speaking beside him. At the time I thought she was simply being old-fashioned. Now those words landed differently. I stepped back away from the porch. "That's fine," I said quietly. "I don't need the coat." Patricia crossed her arms tightly. "Good." Then she added the line she had probably rehearsed all afternoon. "You should be grateful Daniel is handling this peacefully." Peacefully. I almost admired the audacity. Daniel finally looked uncomfortable. Not guilty. Just uncomfortable. Like a man realizing a dinner reservation might become awkward. That hurt more than yelling would have. Because once upon a time Daniel had loved me deeply. I know he did. We met in 1994 at a 4th of July fundraiser in Denver. He spilled iced tea on my white blouse, spent 20 minutes apologizing, then asked me to dinner before the night ended. He had kind eyes back then. Warm eyes. The kind that made you feel safe. And for years he really was safe. Until Patricia slowly became the third person in our marriage, not openly. Subtly. Always subtly. She questioned every vacation we took. Every renovation. Every financial decision. Every holiday. When we struggled financially after the recession, Patricia suddenly became even more involved. She helped us refinance, helped organize paperwork, helped Daniel manage accounts. Grandma Eleanor noticed immediately. "She inserts herself into your marriage like smoke under a door," she once said. I defended Patricia every time. I defended Daniel too. That's what wives from my generation were taught to do. Protect the marriage. Keep peace. Absorb discomfort quietly. And slowly, without realizing it, you disappear. The sound of a truck turning onto the street pulled me back into the present. Daniel looked toward the road nervously. A black SUV rolled slowly toward the curb in front of the house. Patricia's expression changed instantly. "That's them," she muttered. "The buyers." Interesting. I watched Daniel straighten his shirt nervously while Patricia forced another polished smile onto her face. The SUV parked. 2 men stepped out. One was younger, probably an attorney. The other looked around 70. Expensive coat, silver hair, calm posture. He carried himself like someone accustomed to entering tense rooms without fear. The older man looked directly at me first. Not Daniel. Not Patricia. Me. Then he glanced toward the house. "Interesting timing," he said. Daniel quickly stepped forward, holding out his hand. "Daniel Whitmore. We spoke on the phone." The older man shook it briefly. "Walter Bishop." His attorney opened a leather folder beside him. Patricia immediately shifted into hostess mode. "We're just finishing a family matter." Walter's eyes rested on the divorce papers in Daniel's hands. "Yes," he said calmly, "I can see that." Something about his tone made my stomach tighten. He turned toward me again. "You must be Claire." I nodded slowly. Walter studied me carefully for several seconds. Then he said something that changed the entire atmosphere instantly. "Your grandmother spoke very highly of you." Daniel froze. Patricia blinked hard. And suddenly, the air felt different. Walter reached into his coat pocket and removed a folded envelope. Cream-colored. My grandmother's handwriting. I recognized it instantly. My heart skipped. Walter held the envelope carefully between 2 fingers. She asked me to give you this personally, he said, but only under specific circumstances. Nobody spoke. Even Patricia stayed silent now. Walter continued calmly. She said if this house was ever sold without your full knowledge. He paused, then looked directly at Daniel. There would likely be confusion about ownership. Daniel laughed nervously. What confusion? Walter didn't even glance at him. Instead, he handed me the envelope. My hands trembled slightly as I took it. I stared at Eleanor's handwriting across the front. For Claire, if Patricia finally gets her way. A cold wave moved slowly through my body. Not fear. Recognition. Grandma knew. Somehow, she knew. Daniel stepped closer now. Claire, what is this? I looked up at him. Really looked at him. At the man I spent almost 30 years trusting. Then I looked at Patricia. And for the very first time since meeting her, I saw fear behind her eyes. Real fear. Not social embarrassment. Not irritation. Fear. Walter's attorney quietly opened another folder. I believe he said calmly before anyone moves into this property, we should discuss the trust agreement connected to the estate. Trust agreement. Daniel's face lost color instantly. Patricia whispered, What trust? And standing there beside the driveway while evening shadows stretched across the lawn, I realized my grandmother Eleanor hadn't simply left me money. She had left me protection. Nobody spoke for several seconds after the words trust agreement left the attorney's mouth. The neighborhood suddenly felt too quiet. A dog barked somewhere down the street. Wind rustled through the pine trees lining the sidewalk. Across the road, Mrs. Hargrove was watering her roses, pretending not to stare. Daniel swallowed hard. I think there's been some misunderstanding. Walter Bishop calmly removed his gloves. No, he said. I don't believe there has. Patricia stepped forward immediately, forcing a laugh that sounded painfully artificial now. This is absurd. Daniel legally owned this property. The younger attorney finally spoke. Partially, he corrected. Partially. I watched Daniel's face carefully. That single word frightened him more than anything else so far. Patricia noticed too. She turned toward him sharply. What does that mean? Daniel didn't answer. Walter looked toward me gently. Mrs. Harper, would you like to open the letter now? I nodded slowly. My fingers trembled as I unfolded the envelope. The paper smelled faintly of Eleanor's perfume, lavender and cedarwood. For one painful second, I forgot the house, forgot Daniel, forgot Patricia. All I could think about was my grandmother sitting alone in her Aspen study during her final weeks, knowing she was dying while quietly preparing for this exact moment. I unfolded the letter carefully. Claire, if you are reading this, then I was right to worry. I stopped breathing for a second. Walter remained silent while Daniel shifted impatiently beside the porch. I continued reading. You always believed love could fix dishonesty. That was your mother's weakness too. A lump rose painfully in my throat. My mother died when I was 19. Eleanor rarely spoke about her directly. The letter continued. Daniel is not an evil man. But weak men become dangerous when stronger people whisper in their ears long enough. My eyes lifted instinctively toward Patricia. She looked furious now. Give me that, she snapped. Walter's attorney stepped between us immediately. Number. Patricia froze. Probably not used to hearing that word. Daniel rubbed both hands over his face. This is insane. No, Walter replied calmly again. What's insane is selling property connected to an active trust without understanding the legal structure. Daniel stared at him. What trust? Walter exchanged a brief glance with the attorney. Then the attorney opened the folder fully. 6 years ago, he explained Mrs. Eleanor Bennett quietly transferred a protected ownership percentage connected to this property after assisting with Mr. Whitmore's financial liabilities. My mind flashed backward instantly. 6 years earlier, Daniel's construction business had nearly collapsed after 2 terrible contracts and a lawsuit involving faulty roofing materials. We almost lost everything. Daniel spent months panicking about debt collectors' loans and refinancing. Then suddenly, everything stabilized. When I asked how, he told me Patricia had helped arrange financing. But now another memory surfaced. Grandma Eleanor calling me late one evening. Don't worry about the house, she had said softly. I handled it. At the time, I assumed she meant emotional support. Now I understood. She literally handled it. Daniel looked pale. What percentage? The attorney answered immediately. Enough to complicate unauthorized sale proceedings. Patricia exploded. Oh, for God's sake, Daniel, what did you sign? There were hundreds of pages, he snapped back. And you signed them without reading. You told me the refinancing had to happen fast. The silence afterward was almost embarrassing, because suddenly the truth stood naked in front of all of us. They weren't masterminds. They were greedy amateurs. Walter adjusted his coat calmly while Patricia's composure began cracking apart piece by piece. She pointed at me furiously. She knew about this. I didn't, I said honestly. And I truly hadn't. Not fully. But Grandma had. That realization settled deep inside me now. Eleanor had spent years watching quietly while Patricia maneuvered through our lives like a woman rearranging furniture inside someone else's house. And she planned accordingly. Daniel looked at me desperately now. Claire, listen, we can figure this out. Interesting. 10 minutes earlier, I was homeless. Now suddenly we existed again. I folded Grandma's letter carefully. You already figured things out, Daniel. That's not fair. I laughed softly before I could stop myself. Not cruelly. Just tired. You sold our house while I was burying my grandmother. Patricia interrupted immediately. It was legally his house. Walter finally looked directly at her. No, he said calmly. That assumption may become very expensive. Patricia's face went white. The younger attorney closed the folder. At minimum, the buyers were not informed about active trust entanglements connected to the property. Daniel looked genuinely sick now. Walter spoke carefully, almost kindly. My legal team discovered the issue this afternoon during final review. Patricia crossed her arms tightly. So what now? Walter glanced toward the house. Now he said we pause everything before someone makes this worse. Daniel suddenly turned toward me. You knew this would happen. Number. Then why were you smiling? I looked at him quietly for several seconds. Because the answer had finally become clear. I smiled because for the first time in years, I wasn't trapped anymore. Not financially. Not emotionally. Not inside a marriage where every decision quietly passed through Patricia first. The realization felt strange. Painful. But freeing too. Walter gently motioned toward the letter in my hands. There's more, he said. I looked back down and continued reading. Claire, if Patricia is standing nearby while you read this, then I imagine she still believes money makes people powerful. But real power is patience. And people who underestimate quiet women usually regret it eventually. I could practically hear Eleanor's voice saying the words. Patricia looked furious enough to explode. Daniel suddenly seemed smaller somehow. Older? Walter spoke softly. Your grandmother asked me to help if necessary. Why, I whispered. Walter smiled sadly. Because she loved you. That nearly broke me. Not the money. Not the house. That. The simple certainty that someone saw everything happening around me for years and cared enough to prepare for it. Daniel stepped down from the porch finally. Claire. I held up one hand gently. Number? He stopped immediately. And for the first time since our marriage began, he actually listened. Walter suggested we continue the conversation somewhere private. Patricia objected immediately. We are not sneaking off to some back room over made-up legal nonsense. Walter didn't even react. He simply turned toward me. Claire, it struck me then that nobody had asked what I wanted in a very long time. Not really. Daniel usually decided. Patricia always influenced. And I adapted. Smoothed things over. Kept peace. That had been my role for decades. But standing there with my grandmother's letter still trembling in my hands, I realized I was tired of peace that only existed when I stayed silent. I'd like to hear the rest, I said. Walter nodded once. There's a hotel lounge about 5 minutes away. Patricia scoffed loudly. Oh, please. But Daniel interrupted her this time. Mom, stop. The word startled both of us. Mom, not Patricia. Not mother. A little boy's voice hiding inside a 70-year-old man. Patricia looked offended. Daniel looked exhausted. The younger attorney handed Walter another folder while I slowly walked back toward my car. Daniel followed me halfway down the driveway. Claire, wait. I stopped but didn't turn around immediately. His voice softened. You know I'd never intentionally hurt you. I closed my eyes briefly. There it was again. The careful wording. Not, I didn't hurt you. Just not intentionally. I turned slowly toward him. You sold our house while I was at my grandmother's will reading. His shoulders sagged. It wasn't supposed to happen like this. How was it supposed to happen? He opened his mouth, then closed it again. Because there was no answer that didn't sound ugly. Patricia suddenly called from the porch. Daniel. One word. Sharp enough to cut rope. And like instinct, he looked back at her immediately. That told me everything I needed to know. Again. The hotel lounge was quiet and dimly lit, mostly older couples eating early dinners, and tourists escaping the evening cold. Walter reserved a private corner table near the fireplace while his attorney spread documents carefully across the polished wood. Daniel sat beside me automatically. Patricia sat beside him even faster. Like she was afraid physical distance might weaken her control. I kept Grandma Eleanor's letter folded tightly in my lap. Walter removed his glasses. Before we continue, he said calmly, I want to clarify something. Nobody interrupted him. The sale itself may not be completely invalid. Patricia immediately smirked again. But Walter continued. However, depending on intent disclosure and timing, several serious legal complications exist. Daniel rubbed his forehead. What complications? The younger attorney answered. Failure to disclose protected trust interests, potential financial concealment during marital dissolution proceedings, improper transfer timing. Patricia waved her hand dismissively. You lawyers make everything sound dramatic. The attorney looked directly at her. No, ma'am, courts do. That shut her up for a moment. Walter turned toward me gently. Claire, your grandmother requested that this second envelope only be opened if you discovered evidence of betrayal involving the property. My stomach tightened. Second envelope. Of course there was another one. Eleanor had always believed important things deserved layers. She once wrapped my Christmas gifts inside 5 separate boxes just because she enjoyed suspense. Walter slid the envelope toward me. I stared at it silently. My grandmother's handwriting again. For Claire, when the truth finally becomes impossible to ignore. My chest hurt reading that. Because deep down, I think part of me always knew. Not about the house. Not about the divorce. But about Daniel slowly disappearing from our marriage year after year while I pretended not to notice. I opened the envelope carefully. Inside was another handwritten letter. And several photocopied documents, bank transfers, property records, emails. I looked down at the first sentence. Claire, if you are reading this, then Patricia finally overplayed her hand. Patricia shifted uncomfortably beside Daniel. I continued reading silently for several seconds before my breathing slowed completely. Then I looked up, at Daniel. You used my inheritance from my mother. He blinked hard. What? I lifted one of the documents. You told me we used your savings during the recession. Patricia suddenly leaned forward. Claire, now wait a minute. Number? The word surprised even me. Patricia froze. I stared directly at Daniel. You used the money my mother left me. He looked trapped now. Cornered. Like a tired man who suddenly realizes every locked door around him was built by his own choices. It was temporary, he muttered weakly. How much? Silence. How much, Daniel? Finally. Almost all of it. The fireplace crackled softly beside us. Somewhere across the lounge, silverware clinked against plates. Ordinary sounds. Ordinary life continuing while mine quietly cracked open. My mother left me $80,000 when she died. Not enough to change a life, but enough to matter. Enough to remember her by. Daniel reached toward me carefully. Claire, I was trying to save the business. Patricia immediately jumped in. And that business fed you for years. Walter calmly slid another document across the table. Actually, he said the business losses accelerated after several withdrawals connected to Patricia Whitmore's investment accounts. The silence afterward felt enormous. Daniel slowly turned toward his mother. Patricia's face drained pale. What? Walter adjusted the paper slightly. Mrs. Whitmore encouraged several high-risk investments during the same period Mr. Whitmore claimed financial hardship. Daniel stared at her. You said those accounts were protected. Patricia snapped instantly. They were supposed to be. Supposed to be. There it was, the truth finally dragging itself into daylight. Daniel wasn't innocent. But he wasn't the mastermind either. He was weak. Weak enough to follow the loudest voice in the room. Grandma Eleanor had seen that years before I did. I looked back down at her letter. You cannot save people who willingly hand their conscience to someone else. A tear slid down my cheek before I could stop it. Not because of the money. Because I suddenly realized how long I had been fighting alone for a marriage Daniel stopped protecting years ago. Walter spoke softly. Your grandmother didn't want you destroyed financially after the divorce. Divorce. The word sounded different now. Not like death. Like release. Daniel finally whispered, Claire, I'm sorry. And for the first time all evening, I believed he meant it. But strangely, that no longer changed anything. The strange thing about betrayal is this. Sometimes the pain doesn't arrive all at once. Sometimes it comes quietly, layer by layer, until one final truth makes everything collapse together. That night in the hotel lounge, I watched 27 years of marriage unravel in less than an hour. And oddly enough, I wasn't the person falling apart. Patricia was. "You're making me sound like some criminal," she snapped at Walter. Walter remained perfectly calm. "I'm making you sound documented." The younger attorney slid another set of papers across the table. Patricia barely looked at them. Daniel did. And as he read, something changed in his face. Shock first, then confusion, then anger. Real anger. Not toward me. Toward her. "You moved money out of the business account." Patricia crossed her arms defensively. "It was temporary." Daniel laughed once under his breath. A bitter sound. "That's what I told Claire." Patricia's eyes narrowed instantly. "Don't start blaming me for your decisions." "My decisions," Daniel stared at her. "You told me Claire would take everything if we waited. And I was protecting you." "No," he said quietly. "You were protecting yourself." That sentence hung heavily over the table. I sat silently beside them, watching the two people who had spent years operating like a team suddenly turn on each other the moment consequences appeared. Grandma Eleanor used to say, "Greed is loyal only until fear arrives." Now I understood exactly what she meant. Walter closed one folder calmly. "At this point, I strongly recommend everyone retain separate legal counsel." Patricia scoffed. "Oh, please, nobody's going to court over this." The younger attorney looked directly at her. "Ma'am, there's already enough here for civil litigation." Daniel went pale again. Patricia snapped toward him immediately. "Stop looking frightened." "I should be frightened." "No, you should stay calm and let professionals handle this." Daniel suddenly laughed again, this time louder. "Professionals, Mom, you told me this would be easy." Every older couple in the lounge was pretending not to stare now. Patricia lowered her voice sharply. "Keep your voice down." But Daniel had finally reached that dangerous, emotional place people arrive at when humiliation becomes stronger than denial. "No," he said, "you pushed this." Patricia leaned closer. "And who signed the papers?" "You said Claire would never know. You said the trust wasn't important. You said the house was safe. You said a lot of things." Each sentence came out harder, sharper, years of obedience cracking open all at once. And suddenly I saw something clearly. Daniel had spent his entire life trying to earn Patricia's approval, even now, even after everything. Part of him still wanted her to tell him this would somehow be okay. But Patricia wasn't comforting him anymore. Because frightened people stop protecting others. They protect themselves. I quietly folded Grandma Eleanor's letters and placed them back inside my purse. Walter noticed. "You all right?" I nodded slowly. And surprisingly, I was. Not happy. Not untouched. But steady. For years I thought losing my marriage would destroy me. Now I realized something worse had already happened long ago. I had spent decades shrinking myself to keep that marriage alive. The destruction had already happened. I just hadn't called it by its real name. Daniel turned toward me suddenly. "Claire, please say something." I looked at him carefully. At the man who once danced with me barefoot in our kitchen at midnight. The man who held my hand at my mother's funeral. The man who now sat trapped between guilt and fear while his mother silently calculated escape routes beside him. "What do you want me to say?" "That I'm sorry." "You already said that." "I mean it." "I know." That seemed to confuse him more than anger would have. Because guilt feels manageable when the other person screams. Quiet acceptance feels final. Patricia abruptly stood from the table. "This conversation is finished." Walter remained seated. "No, ma'am, it's just beginning." She grabbed her purse aggressively. "I am not sitting here while strangers threaten my family." Family. Interesting word. Because Patricia spent years treating me like an intruder inside hers. Daniel looked up at her. "You took money from the business." Patricia exhaled sharply. "Oh, stop acting shocked. I was trying to protect our future." "You hid it from me. I managed it." "That's not the same thing." Patricia looked at him like he was disappointing her. Daniel, weak men always panic once things become uncomfortable. The sentence hit him hard. I could see it. Because for the first time in his life, he realized she didn't actually love him unconditionally either. She valued usefulness, control, compliance. And now that he had failed publicly, her loyalty was evaporating. Walter slowly stood. "I think tonight has been emotionally exhausting for everyone." He looked toward me. "Claire, my driver can take you to Aspen if you'd like." Patricia laughed coldly. "Of course, send her to her mansion." But the insult landed differently now. Because underneath the bitterness, I heard envy. Real envy. Daniel looked stunned. "You're leaving tonight?" I nodded. "There's nothing left for me here." The words surprised me with their truth, not just the house. Denver itself suddenly felt heavy, filled with memories that no longer belonged to me. Daniel stood quickly. "Claire, wait." His voice cracked slightly. That almost hurt more than everything else. Because once upon a time, I would have stayed. I would have explained, comforted, tried again. But Grandma Eleanor's final gift wasn't money. It was clarity. And clarity changes people permanently. Patricia grabbed Daniel's arm. "Let her go." He pulled away from her instantly. For the first time. "Number." Patricia blinked in shock. Daniel looked at me desperately. "Please don't leave like this." I picked up my purse slowly. "You already left first." Silence. Heavy silence. The kind people remember years later. Walter walked me toward the hotel entrance while the younger attorney stayed behind with Daniel and Patricia. Outside, cold mountain air filled my lungs. The night smelled like pine and snow. Walter opened the car door for me gently. Before getting inside, I looked back through the hotel windows one last time. Patricia was speaking furiously. Daniel sat motionless beside her, not defending her anymore, not defending himself either, just staring at the table like a man finally seeing the ruins of his own choices. And for the first time in decades, I felt absolutely certain about walking away. I arrived in Aspen a little after 2 in the morning. Snow covered the long, winding driveway leading toward Eleanor's estate, turning the entire property silver beneath the moonlight. The caretaker, a quiet older man named Benji, opened the gates after Walter called ahead. "Miss Claire," he said gently when I stepped from the car, "I'm sorry about your grandmother." Those words nearly broke me harder than everything else combined. Because for hours, nobody had spoken about Eleanor herself. Only money, property, divorce, ownership. But Grandma Eleanor wasn't paperwork. She was the woman who taught me how to bake peach cobbler. The woman who mailed handwritten birthday cards every single year no matter where I lived. The woman who once drove 12 hours through a snowstorm after my mother died because she refused to let me grieve alone. And now she was gone. The estate looked exactly the same as always. Warm lights glowing through tall windows. Smoke rising softly from the stone chimney. The porch swing creaking gently in the wind. For one strange second, I expected Eleanor to open the front door holding teacups and asking why I took so long getting there. Instead, only silence greeted me. Benji carried my overnight bag inside while I stood alone in the foyer staring at the familiar wooden staircase. "You should get some sleep," he said kindly. But sleep felt impossible. Everything inside me still felt rearranged. So after Benji went upstairs, I wandered slowly through the house instead. The grandfather clock in the hallway ticked softly. The kitchen still smelled faintly of cinnamon. A knitted blanket Eleanor kept folded near the fireplace remained exactly where she left it. It felt less like entering a mansion, and more like entering memory itself. I eventually found myself standing inside Eleanor's study, her favorite room. Dark bookshelves, leather chair, soft jazz records stacked near the window. And there, sitting neatly in the center of her desk, was another letter, of course. I laughed quietly to myself through sudden tears. Even dead Grandma Eleanor still had perfect timing. I sat down slowly and opened it. "Claire, if you are reading this from my study, then things became uglier than I hoped." I smiled despite myself. That woman knew everything. The letter continued. "First breathe. You have spent most of your adult life carrying everyone else's emotions before your own. That habit will exhaust you if you let it continue." I leaned back slowly in Eleanor's chair. Outside, snow drifted quietly past the windows. Inside, the house felt calm in a way my own home hadn't felt in years, maybe ever. The letter continued. "You will be tempted to rescue Daniel emotionally. Do not confuse pity with responsibility." That line landed directly in my chest, because she was right. Even after the betrayal, part of me still worried about him. Not romantically, habitually. Women my age were raised to become emotional caretakers. We soothed, we repaired, we absorbed damage quietly. And after enough years, you stop noticing how heavy that becomes. I folded the letter slowly and stared around the room. Then I noticed something else on Eleanor's desk. A leather journal, my name written across the front. I opened it carefully. Inside were years of notes, observations, thoughts, little things Eleanor noticed but rarely said aloud. One page stopped me cold. Claire apologizes constantly for things that are not her fault. Another, Daniel watches Patricia before answering difficult questions. Another, Claire still believes love means endurance. I closed the journal gently. Not because I was angry, because I felt seen. Completely seen. And maybe for the first time in my entire adult life, understood. The next morning, Aspen looked breathtaking beneath fresh snow. I made coffee in Eleanor's kitchen while sunlight spilled across the mountains outside the windows. For the first time in months, my shoulders didn't hurt. I hadn't realized how tense my body became living around constant emotional pressure. By noon, my phone began exploding with missed calls. Daniel. Again. And again. Voicemails. Texts. Emails. I ignored all of them, until one message finally caught my attention. Please don't let 30 years end like this. I stared at the screen for a long time, then quietly deleted it. Because the truth was, our marriage hadn't ended in one night. It ended slowly, piece by piece, every time he chose silence over honesty. Every time he let Patricia humiliate me to avoid conflict. Every time I accepted less than respect because I thought loyalty required sacrifice. That afternoon, Walter called to update me. The buyers froze everything he explained. Your husband's attorney is requesting negotiations. My husband, Walter chuckled softly. Sorry, habit. Oddly enough, hearing the word husband now felt unfamiliar, like clothing that no longer fit properly. Walter hesitated briefly before continuing. There's something else. What? Patricia hired separate counsel this morning. I closed my eyes slowly. Of course she did. She's blaming Daniel. Yes. I sat quietly beside the fireplace while snow fell heavily outside. Then unexpectedly, I started laughing. Not cruelly, not hysterically. Just tired laughter from a woman finally watching years of manipulation collapse under its own weight. Walter laughed softly too. Your grandmother predicted that part exactly. I'm not surprised. After we hung up, I walked outside onto the porch wrapped in Eleanor's old wool coat. The mountain air stung my lungs beautifully. Everything looked clean. Still, honest. And standing there alone in the silence, I realized something important. I wasn't lonely. Not even a little. For years, I confused companionship with safety. But real safety, real peace, comes from not having to earn basic kindness every single day. That evening, as sunset painted the snow gold and orange across the mountains, I finally stopped mourning my marriage, because deep down, I knew I had actually been grieving it for years. 1 year later, I stood in Eleanor's kitchen watching sunlight spill across the snow-covered mountains, while a blueberry cobbler cooled beside the window. The house smelled like cinnamon and coffee. Peaceful, warm, lived in. For a long time, I thought healing would feel dramatic somehow, like a movie scene where everything suddenly makes sense and all the pain disappears overnight. But healing, at least for me, arrived quietly, in small moments. The first morning I woke up without anxiety twisting inside my stomach. The first evening I realized I hadn't checked my phone waiting for Daniel's mood to determine mine. The first holiday dinner where nobody criticized the way I cooked, dressed, spoke, or laughed. Tiny freedoms. That's what healing really was. Tiny freedoms repeated enough times to become a life. Outside, fresh snow drifted gently across the Aspen property, while guests slowly began arriving for dinner. Nothing extravagant. Just people who genuinely loved me. Benji carried wood toward the fireplace while my old friend Marianne arranged flowers across the dining table. Walter arrived carrying 2 bottles of wine and immediately started arguing with Benji about football. Normal things. Good things. The kind of things I spent years believing would eventually happen inside my marriage if I just tried harder. But some homes never become peaceful because chaos benefits the people creating it. That lesson took me nearly 70 years to understand. Marianne walked into the kitchen, smiling. You look lighter. I laughed softly. That obvious? Yes. She kissed my cheek gently before lowering her voice. Have you heard from Daniel? I nodded once. Twice, actually. The first letter arrived 6 months earlier. Apologies. Regret. Loneliness. The second came shortly before Christmas. Shorter. Sadness replacing excuses. He wrote that Patricia barely spoke to him anymore after the lawsuits began. Several friends disappeared once the scandal spread through their social circles. The construction business eventually collapsed completely under legal debt and public embarrassment. In his final paragraph, he wrote, Your grandmother understood people better than I ever did. I never answered. Not because I hated him. Strangely enough, I didn't. Time had softened the sharpest parts of my anger. What remained was something quieter. Acceptance. Daniel wasn't destroyed by one terrible decision. He was destroyed slowly by years of weakness. And honestly, so was I. Just differently. For most of my adult life, I confused self-sacrifice with love. I believed enduring unhappiness made me loyal. I believed keeping peace made me wise. I believed forgiving endlessly made me strong. But Eleanor understood something I didn't. Love without respect eventually becomes permission. And permission invites mistreatment. The front door opened again as Walter entered the kitchen, carrying snow across the hardwood floor. Bad news, he announced dramatically. Benji still believes the Broncos can recover next season. I laughed harder than I had in years. Real laughter. The kind that rises naturally instead of carefully. Walter smiled warmly, watching me. You know, he said quietly once Marianne stepped away, your grandmother would be very proud of you. That nearly made me cry immediately. Not because of the inheritance. Not because of Aspen. Because for the first time, I finally believed it might actually be true. Dinner that evening stretched for hours. Stories. Laughter. Old memories. At one point, Marianne accidentally burned the dinner rolls and everyone teased her so badly she threatened to leave the table forever. Walter spilled wine on his sweater. Benji cheated at cards. Simple things. Beautiful things. And sitting there surrounded by warmth instead of tension. I suddenly understood what Eleanor had really given me. Not money. Not property. Not revenge. She gave me clarity before it was too late to rebuild my life. That was the real inheritance. Later that night, after everyone left, I stepped outside onto the porch, alone, wrapped in Eleanor's old coat. Snow covered the mountains beneath moonlight. The world looked soft and silent. I sat slowly on the porch swing Daniel built years ago. Ironically, Walter tracked it down after the house sale collapsed and had it returned to Aspen as a joke. I ran my hand gently across the wood. For years I thought home was another person. A marriage. A family. A place where someone promised to stay. But age teaches you difficult truths. Sometimes the people you love most become the people you survive. And sometimes losing the wrong people is the first honest step toward finding peace. The cold mountain air filled my lungs as I looked out across Eleanor's property one final time. Then quietly, mostly to myself, I said, for years I begged people to love me the way I deserved. Now I know real love never asks you to shrink first. The wind moved softly through the trees. Somewhere far below Aspen glowed quietly in the distance. And for the first time in a very long time, I felt completely at home. If this story meant something to you, if you've ever stayed too long in places that slowly broke your spirit, I hope you remember this. It is never too late to choose peace over performance. And sometimes the greatest revenge is simply becoming someone nobody can control anymore. Thank you for spending this time with me. And if this story touched your heart, I'd love for you to share it with someone who may need the reminder too. Good God. The retired 4-star general pushed back his chair so abruptly that every conversation in the ballroom stopped. His eyes were locked on the faded Navy watch on my wrist. Where did you get that? He asked. I glanced around the room. Nearly 200 people had gone silent. Bank presidents, judges, developers, politicians, the wealthiest people in Charleston. My husband looked annoyed. The general took another step toward me. Ma'am, he said, his voice suddenly unsteady. That watch, where did you get it? I swallowed. It belonged to my father. What was his name? I hesitated. Then I answered. Captain Michael Whitaker. The color drained from the general's face. For a moment he looked 20 years older. Then he shot to his feet. Captain Whitaker's daughter. The room became so quiet I could hear glasses being set down. My husband stared at the general as if he'd lost his mind. The general looked at me, then at Richard, then back at me. And that's when he said the words that changed everything. Good God. He shook his head slowly. He has no idea who you are. That moment became the talk of Charleston for months. But to understand why it happened, you have to understand who I was before that night, and who my husband believed I was. My name is Sarah Whitaker. I'm 58 years old. Retired from the United States Navy, and for most of my life I was perfectly comfortable being overlooked. I grew up in military housing, the kind with thin walls and squeaky floors, the kind where every family on the block knew what deployment felt like. My father served in the Navy for nearly 3 decades. My grandfather had served before him. Military service wasn't something extraordinary in our family. It was simply what people did. My father used to say something that stayed with me my entire life. Character is what remains when nobody is watching. He believed it, lived it, expected it. We weren't rich, not even close. My mother clipped coupons. We drove used cars. Vacations usually meant visiting relatives instead of resorts. But I never felt deprived. Because in our home, respect mattered more than money. Duty mattered more than recognition, and integrity mattered more than appearances. Those lessons eventually carried me into the Navy myself. I served for over 25 years, most of it quietly. I wasn't a hero. I wasn't famous. I simply did my job. When I retired as a commander, I felt proud of my career and grateful for the people I'd served alongside. A few years later, I met Richard. At first, he seemed charming, confident, successful. He owned a thriving real estate development company in Charleston. He could walk into any room and immediately become the center of attention. People liked him. Investors trusted him. And after years of military life, I found his confidence refreshing. We married when I was 46. For a while, things were good. Or at least I thought they were. Looking back, I can see signs I ignored. Small comments, subtle dismissals, tiny moments that seemed harmless at the time. Richard measured success differently than I did. To him, accomplishments had dollar signs attached. The size of your house, the make of your car, the club you belonged to, the people who returned your phone calls. I didn't think much of it initially. Everyone has different priorities. But over the years, those differences became harder to ignore. Especially when it came to my family. Richard never openly insulted them. Not at first. He simply dismissed them. Whenever conversations turned toward family histories, he'd happily discuss wealthy entrepreneurs, local business leaders, and prominent Charleston families. When my family came up, his interest vanished. One evening years earlier, he had looked through an old photo album. Pictures of my father, my grandfather, military ceremonies, ships, deployments, uniforms. He closed the album. Interesting, he said. That was it. Interesting. As though decades of service could be summarized in a single word. I remember feeling disappointed. Not angry, just disappointed. Still, I let it go. I always let things go. Perhaps that's one of my flaws. My father believed dignity often meant remaining silent. Sometimes that's true. Sometimes it isn't. The charity gala took place in early spring, one of Charleston's largest annual fundraising events. Black ties, formal gowns, crystal chandeliers, expensive wine, the kind of evening Richard loved. He spent weeks preparing, choosing suits, meeting donors, planning conversations. I attended because I was his wife, nothing more. The ballroom overlooked the harbor. As the sun disappeared beyond the water, the room filled with laughter and networking. Richard moved effortlessly among the guests. I followed along politely, shaking hands, making conversation, listening more than speaking. At one point, we joined a table filled with local business leaders, a banker, a state judge, several prominent donors. One woman smiled warmly. So, Sarah, tell us about your family. A simple question, the kind people ask every day. Before I could answer, Richard laughed. Not a cruel laugh. Not yet. Just an amused one. Oh, her family. He took a sip of wine. They're military people. The table nodded politely. Richard shrugged. A family of nobodies, really. Several guests chuckled awkwardly. One man smiled. Another looked uncomfortable. Nobody challenged him. Nobody knew what to say. And for a moment, neither did I. The words weren't loud. They weren't dramatic. But they landed harder than he realized. A family of nobodies. I thought about my grandfather crossing the Pacific during World War II. I thought about my father spending months at sea. I thought about military funerals, folded flags, sacrifices, long absences, missed birthdays, years of service. A family of nobodies. I felt something tighten inside my chest. Not anger. Not exactly. More like sadness. The kind that comes when someone you love reveals a truth about themselves. A truth you've been avoiding for years. I looked down at my wrist. My father's old Navy watch rested beneath the cuff of my dress sleeve. The metal was worn smooth from decades of use. I still wore it on special occasions. Not because it was valuable. Because it reminded me who I came from. And who I wanted to be. I could have corrected Richard. Could have argued. Could have listed accomplishments. Ranks. Awards. History. Instead, I remembered my father's voice. Never chase validation. So I stayed quiet. The conversation moved on. The guests forgot about the comment. Or so I thought. Across the ballroom, an elderly gentleman had stopped walking. He was staring directly at my wrist. His expression had completely changed. At first, I didn't recognize him. Then realization struck. The man wasn't just another guest. He was General Thomas Bradley, one of the most respected military leaders of his generation. And he was walking straight toward me. Slowly. Deliberately. Without taking his eyes off my father's watch. The closer he came, the more serious his expression became. and suddenly I knew something extraordinary was about to happen. General Thomas Bradley stopped beside our table. The room didn't notice him at first. Most people were busy talking, sipping wine, or discussing business deals. But I noticed, and so did Richard. The general wasn't looking at anyone else. His eyes remained fixed on the old Navy watch resting on my wrist. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then he cleared his throat. "Ma'am," he said. His voice carried the calm authority of a man who had spent decades commanding troops. "May I ask you something?" I stood politely. "Of course, General." He pointed gently toward the watch. "Where did you get that?" I glanced down. The watch looked ordinary. The stainless steel case was scratched. The leather band had been replaced years ago. Nothing about it suggested importance. "It belonged to my father," I said. The general's expression tightened. "Your father?" "Yes, sir." The table had grown quiet. Nearby guests were beginning to pay attention. General Bradley stepped closer. What was his name? Something about his tone made my heart beat faster. I wasn't sure why. Captain Michael Whitaker. For a second, the general simply stared at me. Then all color seemed to leave his face. His eyes widened. The reaction was so sudden that several people noticed immediately. Even Richard looked confused. The general whispered something under his breath. Then he stood completely upright. "Captain Whitaker's daughter." I nodded. "Yes, sir." His hands trembled slightly. Not from age, from emotion. The room around us continued growing quieter. Conversations faded. People sensed something important was happening. General Bradley took a slow breath. Then, to my complete surprise, he extended his hand. Not casually, respectfully, almost formally. I shook it. He looked directly into my eyes. I haven't heard that name spoken in nearly 20 years. I didn't know what to say. My father had been gone for almost a decade. Outside military circles, few people remembered him. Richard glanced between us. "I'm sorry," he interrupted politely. "Do you know Sarah's father?" The general turned toward him. The expression on his face changed instantly. Not hostile, not angry, simply astonished. "Know him." He looked back at me, then back at Richard. "My son, some men spend an entire lifetime hoping to possess half the courage Michael Whitaker had." The table fell silent. Every single person was listening now. Richard forced a smile. "I'm sure he was a fine officer." The general's eyebrows lifted. "A fine officer?" He almost laughed. "No," he shook his head. "Captain Whitaker was far more than that." Someone nearby pulled out a chair for the general. Instead of sitting, he remained standing, as though the memory itself demanded respect. Guests from nearby tables had begun drifting closer. Nobody wanted to miss whatever story was unfolding. General Bradley looked at me. "Did your father ever tell you about the North Atlantic incident?" I frowned. "No, sir." A faint smile crossed his face. "Of course he didn't." That sounded exactly like my father. He never spoke about his accomplishments. Never. As a child, I often learned more about his career from other sailors than from him. The general folded his hands. Most of it remained classified for years. Now people were openly gathering around us. The ballroom had become unusually quiet. Even the live music seemed distant. The general continued. 40 years ago, during the Cold War, your father's ship encountered a crisis in the North Atlantic." He paused. "I can't discuss every detail even now, but I can tell you this." His voice softened. "There were young sailors aboard who should not have survived that night." I listened carefully. I'd never heard this story. Not once. The general looked toward the harbor visible through the ballroom windows, as if seeing another time. Conditions were terrible, equipment failures, dangerous seas, a chain of events nobody expected. He returned his gaze to me. "Your father refused to abandon his people." I felt a lump form in my throat. The general continued. "He stayed where the danger was greatest." The room remained completely silent. "He personally led rescue efforts for hours." Someone nearby whispered, "My God." The general nodded. Several men later credited him with saving their lives. I stared at him. "Why didn't he ever tell us?" The general smiled sadly. "Because men like your father rarely do." That answer felt painfully familiar. My father never talked about medals, never discussed recognition. Whenever someone praised him, he changed the subject. Growing up, I thought all military families were like that. Only later did I realize how unusual he truly was. Richard shifted uncomfortably. For the first time that evening, he looked uncertain. The confidence he normally carried seemed to be fading. The general noticed. Everyone noticed. And then came the moment that changed the entire atmosphere of the room. A wealthy donor standing nearby asked a question. If Captain Whitaker was so respected, why haven't we heard of him? The general smiled. Because he spent his life avoiding attention. A few people nodded. The donor looked surprised. But surely he received awards. Oh, he did. The general chuckled softly. Many of them. Then he looked directly at me. I assume he never displayed them. I laughed despite myself. No, sir. Of course not. The general shook his head. That's exactly what I expected. The crowd laughed gently. For the first time all evening I felt warmth instead of embarrassment. Not because of the attention. Because someone understood my father. Truly understood him. The general's voice became more serious. Do you know why people respected Michael Whitaker? I shook my head. He answered immediately. Because he never cared about recognition. His eyes swept across the ballroom. Across the expensive suits, the designer dresses, the luxury watches, the symbols of success. He cared about people. Nobody spoke. The message hung in the air. I saw several veterans in attendance nod quietly. They understood. Maybe better than anyone. The general looked toward Richard. The room seemed to hold its breath. Then he asked a simple question. Sir, how long have you been married? Richard blinked. 12 years. 12 years. The general repeated the words slowly. Then he looked genuinely stunned. 12 years and you never learned who her father was. A few people shifted awkwardly. Richard's face reddened. I knew he served in the Navy. The general stared at him. Then at me. Finally, he shook his head. That's when he spoke the words everyone would later repeat across Charleston. Words that would spread through country clubs, veteran halls, and dinner tables for months. Good God. His voice was barely above a whisper. He has no idea who you are. The room froze. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. I felt every eye turn toward me. For the first time all evening, Richard looked genuinely shaken. And deep inside, I realized something important. This wasn't about my father's reputation. It wasn't about military honors. It wasn't even about the watch. It was about respect. For 12 years, my husband had never truly tried to understand where I came from. And now, in front of the entire city elite, that truth was becoming impossible to ignore. As the general prepared to tell the rest of the story, I saw something in Richard's eyes I had never seen before. Fear. For several seconds after General Bradley spoke those words, nobody in the ballroom said anything. The silence wasn't uncomfortable. It was thoughtful. The kind of silence that settles over a room when people suddenly realize they've misunderstood something important. I glanced at Richard. His expression had changed completely. The confident smile he had worn all evening was gone. For perhaps the first time since I'd met him, he looked uncertain. General Bradley remained standing beside me. The old soldier seemed less interested in impressing anyone than in correcting a misunderstanding. And that misunderstanding wasn't about my father. It was about what makes a life meaningful. A woman standing near the front finally broke the silence. "Why, General Bradley," she asked gently, "was Captain Whitaker really that respected?" The general smiled. Then he gave an answer I'll never forget. No, several people looked confused. Then he continued. He was more respected than most people in this room can imagine. A few quiet laughs rippled through the crowd. Not mocking laughs. Nervous ones. The general turned toward me. "Sarah, your father would probably be furious with me right now." That made me laugh. "You're probably right." The crowd laughed with us. Because Michael hated attention. The general shook his head. Absolutely hated it. He looked around the room. I spent years trying to convince him to accept public recognition. "What happened?" someone asked. "He always found a reason to avoid it." More laughter. The general pointed at me. "Looks like his daughter inherited that habit." I smiled. That much was true. As the crowd settled in, General Bradley began sharing stories. Not classified stories. Not dramatic movie scenes, just moments that revealed character. The kind of stories military people tell about those they admire. "There was a young sailor once," the general said. "He made a serious mistake during a deployment." The general folded his hands behind his back. The sort of mistake that could have ended a career. Several veterans in the room nodded knowingly. The military can be unforgiving. The general continued. "Most officers would have protected themselves." He looked toward me. "Your father protected the sailor instead." A man nearby frowned. "He took the blame." "In a way." The general nodded. "He accepted responsibility because he believed leaders own failures before they claim successes." I felt my throat tighten. That sounded exactly like my father. Exactly. The general smiled. "The young sailor stayed in the Navy." "What happened to him?" a woman asked. The general's smile widened. He eventually became an admiral. The room erupted in surprised laughter. You're kidding. No, the general chuckled. That admiral still tells the story. I found myself looking down at my father's watch. For years after his death, I'd worried that people would forget him. Not because he needed recognition, because he had mattered. Now I was learning how many lives he had quietly touched. One story led to another, and another. The ballroom had transformed from a charity gala into something closer to a reunion. Veterans approached. Retired officers. Former service members. People I'd never met. Several recognized my father's name immediately. One elderly Marine shook my hand. I served alongside your father once. His eyes glistened. Best officer I ever met. A retired Navy chief nodded. Same here. Another veteran smiled. Your grandfather wasn't bad either. That surprised me. You knew my grandfather. Everybody knew your grandfather. The man laughed. I couldn't help smiling. My grandfather had served in World War II. Growing up, he rarely discussed combat. Most of his stories involved fellow sailors, practical jokes, or life lessons. Only after his death did we discover the extent of his military record. The medals, the commendations, the citations. Even then, my family kept most of it private. That's simply how we were raised. As conversations continued, memories began flooding back. I found myself drifting into childhood, back to a small Navy house in Norfolk, back to evenings around the kitchen table, back to lessons I didn't fully appreciate until adulthood. My father never preached. He taught through example. Every Saturday morning he volunteered somewhere, sometimes veterans groups, sometimes community projects, sometimes helping neighbors. When I was young, I assumed everyone did those things. Later, I realized many people didn't. One summer afternoon, I asked him why he spent so much time helping strangers. His answer stayed with me. Because someday you'll need help too. That was it. No speech, no lecture. Just simple wisdom, the kind that grows more meaningful with age. Meanwhile, Richard remained unusually quiet. I could almost see the gears turning in his mind. For years, he'd judged my family according to standards that made sense in his world. Net worth, influence, connections, status. Now those measurements suddenly seemed inadequate. People weren't gathering around me because my family had been wealthy. They weren't impressed by business success. They were responding to something deeper. Character, service, legacy, values. Things money couldn't purchase. And Richard was beginning to realize it. Eventually, a wealthy businessman approached our group. I'd seen him at previous charity events, the sort of man whose name appeared regularly in local newspapers. He looked at me thoughtfully. Can I ask you something? Of course. He gestured toward the growing crowd. Why didn't you ever tell people about any of this? The question seemed to fascinate everyone. Several people leaned closer. Waiting? I thought carefully before answering. Then I smiled. Because my father taught me that service isn't something you brag about. The room fell quiet again. Not because my answer was profound. Because it was simple. And sometimes simple truths land the hardest. The businessman nodded slowly. I think that's something we've forgotten. Several people murmured in agreement. Even Richard. A few minutes later, General Bradley approached me once more. His expression had grown thoughtful. Almost emotional. There's something else you should know. What is it? He looked around the room, then lowered his voice slightly. Your father and grandfather didn't just serve. I frowned. What do you mean? The general smiled. Have you ever wondered where the Whitaker Scholarship Fund came from? I blinked. Of course I knew the Scholarship Fund. It provided financial assistance to military widows and children. My family had supported it for years, but I'd always assumed it was created by a larger organization. The general shook his head. Your grandfather started it. My eyes widened. What? Your father expanded it. I stared at him. Nobody ever told me that. They didn't want credit. The answer came immediately. Of course it did. That was exactly what my family would do. The general smiled sadly. 3 generations of your family spent their lives helping people without asking for recognition. He glanced toward Richard, then back to me. That's a rare thing these days. For the first time all evening, I saw genuine shame appear on my husband's face. Not embarrassment, not discomfort. Something deeper. The painful realization that he'd spent years misunderstanding the people who had shaped the woman he married. And as I looked into his eyes, I began wondering whether our marriage had been built on something missing from the very beginning. Respect. That question followed me for the rest of the evening. And before the night was over, it would become impossible to ignore. The gala ended shortly before midnight. By then, the story had spread through nearly every corner of the ballroom. People who had barely noticed me at the beginning of the evening were stopping to shake my hand on their way out. Veterans thanked me for my family's service. Several people shared stories about parents, siblings, or children who had served in the military. One woman hugged me unexpectedly. "My husband was Navy," she said softly. "He passed away 3 years ago." I squeezed her hand. No long speech was necessary. Some experiences don't require explanation. We simply understand one another. The ride home was unusually quiet. Richard drove. I looked out the passenger side window. Charleston's historic streets were nearly empty. Streetlights reflected across old brick buildings. The harbor breeze moved gently through the palms. Normally, Richard loved discussing social events after they ended. Who attended? Who donated? Who made important connections? Tonight he said almost nothing. Neither did I. The silence stretched for nearly 20 minutes. Finally, he spoke. I had no idea. His voice sounded smaller than usual. I kept looking out the window. "No." "You should have told me." I turned toward him. For a moment, I simply stared. Then I asked the question that had been sitting in my heart for years. Would it have mattered? Richard didn't answer immediately. And that silence told me everything. The next morning, I woke early. Old Navy habits die hard. Coffee at 6. Local newspaper. Quiet reflection before the world starts moving. Richard was already awake. That surprised me. Normally, he slept later on weekends. Instead, he sat at the kitchen table staring into a cup of coffee. His expression looked troubled. Not tired. Troubled. I poured myself a cup and sat across from him. Neither of us spoke. Eventually, he sighed. I embarrassed myself. I nodded. Yes. He looked down. I didn't mean it the way it sounded. I considered that. Then answered honestly. Richard, that's exactly how you meant it. His eyes lifted. I continued. You just didn't expect anyone to challenge it. The truth hung between us. Neither pleasant nor cruel. Simply true. Over the next few days, something unusual happened. People started talking. Charleston is a beautiful city. It's also a small city in many ways. News travels fast, especially among social circles. By Monday afternoon, Richard had received multiple phone calls. Some were supportive. Others weren't. A retired judge who had attended the gala called him directly. A longtime business associate made a pointed comment during lunch. Several veterans involved with local charities expressed disappointment. Nobody attacked him. Nobody publicly humiliated him. That wasn't the culture of the people involved. Instead, they did something far more uncomfortable. They held him accountable. Quietly, respectfully, firmly. And Richard wasn't used to that. A week later, I overheard part of a phone conversation in his office. The door wasn't completely closed. I wasn't eavesdropping. His voice simply carried down the hallway. What do you mean they're reconsidering? Pause. No, that's ridiculous. Longer pause. I heard frustration entering his voice. Because of one comment. Another pause. Then silence. A few moments later, he ended the call. When he emerged, he looked angry. Not at me. At the situation. What happened? I asked. He rubbed his forehead. Nothing. I waited. Eventually, he sighed. A veterans organization withdrew support from one of our projects. I nodded slowly. I see. They said my comments raised concerns about leadership. I looked at him carefully. And what do you think? His jaw tightened. For several seconds, he said nothing. Then he walked away. Glad. As the weeks passed, the consequences continued. Nothing dramatic. No public scandal. No ruined career. This wasn't that kind of story. Instead, Richard experienced something unfamiliar. People began seeing him differently. Not because of a mistake, because of what the mistake revealed. Character matters. Especially to older Americans, especially to veterans, especially to people who spent their lives valuing service over status. Richard was discovering that lesson firsthand. And he hated it. At first. One evening, about 3 weeks after the gala, we attended a charity board meeting. Several people greeted me warmly. One retired colonel shook my hand. Another volunteer asked about my father. The interactions were friendly. Natural. Nothing excessive. Yet I noticed something. Richard noticed it too. The respect people showed me had nothing to do with wealth. Nothing to do with social standing. Nothing to do with influence. It came from values, from service, from reputation. And for perhaps the first time in his life, Richard realized those things couldn't be purchased. That night after we returned home, the conversation we'd both been avoiding finally happened. We sat on the back porch overlooking our yard. The spring air felt cool. Crickets chirped in the distance. For a long time, neither of us spoke. Then I broke the silence. Why did you say it? Richard stared into the darkness. What? You know what? His shoulders sagged. For once, he didn't pretend, didn't deflect, didn't joke, because I believed it. The honesty surprised me. I appreciated it anyway. He continued. I grew up thinking success meant money. His voice sounded tired. My father worked 3 jobs. I listened quietly. We were always one emergency away from disaster. His eyes remained fixed on the yard. When people have money, they're safe. I nodded. I understand. No. He shook his head. You understand better than I do. That statement carried more truth than he realized. Military families understand uncertainty, deployments, transfers, risk, loss. Nothing is guaranteed. Richard took a deep breath. I spent my entire life chasing security. He laughed bitterly. Somewhere along the way, I started confusing money with value. The words settled heavily between us. I thought about that. Then I asked softly, and my family? His face tightened. I judged them. Why? Because they didn't fit the world I understood. For the first time, I saw genuine vulnerability. Not embarrassment. Not pride. Vulnerability. The kind that appears when someone stops defending themselves. I looked toward the stars above our yard, then back at him. My father spent months away from home. Richard nodded. I know. He missed birthdays. Another nod. Anniversaries. Yes. Holidays. His eyes dropped. I continued. And he'd do it all again. The porch fell silent. Finally, I spoke the words that had been building inside me since the gala. You didn't insult my father. Richard looked up. He isn't here anymore. I felt emotion tightening my chest. You insulted every family that sacrificed alongside him. The words landed hard. I could see it. For several seconds, Richard simply sat there, motionless. Then his eyes filled with tears. Not dramatic tears. Not movie tears. The kind older people recognize. The kind that come from regret. Real regret. When he finally spoke, his voice barely rose above a whisper. I don't know how to fix this. I looked at him carefully, and for the first time in weeks I answered honestly. I don't know either. The admission hurt, because it was true. 12 years of marriage doesn't unravel overnight. Neither does trust. Neither does respect. Both are built slowly. And both can be damaged slowly too. Richard lowered his head. For the first time since I'd known him, he looked genuinely afraid. Not afraid of losing business. Not afraid of public embarrassment. Afraid of losing me. And as I sat there beneath the Charleston night sky, I quietly admitted something to myself. For the first time in our marriage, I wasn't sure whether staying was the right choice. For nearly 2 weeks after our conversation on the porch, Richard changed. Not suddenly. Not dramatically. There was no grand speech. No desperate promises. No dramatic attempts to save our marriage. At my age, I've learned to be cautious around words. Words are easy. Change is hard. And real change takes time. What caught my attention wasn't what Richard said. It was what he started doing. One Saturday morning, I came downstairs expecting to find him watching financial news. Instead, he was sitting at the kitchen table reading something. Several sheets of paper lay spread before him. Old documents. Copies of military records. Photographs. Letters. I recognized them immediately. They had belonged to my father. Richard looked up. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then he quietly asked, Did your father really write all these letters during deployments? I nodded. Every week. He looked down again. The pages seemed fragile in his large hands. I had no idea. There was that phrase again. I had no idea. For years, those words might have irritated me. Now they sounded different. Now they sounded like the beginning of understanding. Over the next several weeks, Richard kept asking questions. Questions he should have asked years earlier. Questions most husbands ask when they genuinely want to know their wives. What was deployment like? How often did my father come home? How did my mother handle the absences? What was it like growing up in military housing? Why had I chosen the Navy? What did service mean to me? At first I answered cautiously. A part of me wondered whether this was temporary, whether guilt was driving his curiosity. But the questions kept coming, and they felt sincere. One evening he surprised me. I called General Bradley. I nearly dropped my coffee cup. You what? Richard smiled awkwardly. He invited me to lunch. I stared. The same general who had unintentionally exposed him in front of Charleston's elite. Why? Richard laughed softly. Because I told him I needed an education. For the first time in weeks, I found myself smiling. Lunch turned into 3 hours, then another meeting, then another. General Bradley became something of an unexpected mentor. Not because Richard wanted military connections, because he wanted perspective. One afternoon after returning home, Richard sat beside me on the couch. The expression on his face looked thoughtful. "Do you know what the general told me today?" "What?" Richard shook his head slowly. "He said your father never cared who got credit." I smiled. "That's true." He said most people spend their lives trying to be important. I nodded. "And the people who actually matter rarely talk about themselves." The room grew quiet. Richard stared toward the window. "I've spent my whole life doing the opposite." There was no self-pity in his voice, just honesty. And honesty is where growth begins. A month later, Richard asked me a question I never expected. "Would you take me somewhere where?" He hesitated, then answered softly, "Arlington." For several seconds, I simply looked at him. My father wasn't buried there, but many people he served with were. Many members of our extended military family rested there. Arlington National Cemetery is sacred ground to anyone who has worn the uniform. I had visited several times. Richard never had. 2 weeks later, we flew to Washington. The morning was cool and overcast. The cemetery stretched before us in perfect rows of white headstones. Orderly, quiet, endless. No matter how many times you visit Arlington, it affects you. The sight humbles you, reminds you how many people carried burdens most Americans never see. Richard walked silently beside me. For nearly an hour, he barely spoke. We passed families visiting loved ones, veterans standing quietly, children asking questions, flags moving gently in the breeze. Eventually, Richard stopped. He stared across hundreds of white markers, his eyes filled with emotion. "I've never seen anything like this." I nodded. "Most people haven't." He swallowed hard. "So many." "Yes, so many sacrifices." I didn't answer. I didn't need to. The place itself provided the lesson. Later that afternoon, we sat on a bench overlooking part of the cemetery. Neither of us spoke for several minutes. Then Richard surprised me again. "I owe your father an apology." I turned toward him. "He isn't here." "I know." His voice trembled slightly. "But I owe him one anyway." I waited. Richard looked down at his hands. "When I mocked your family, I thought I was judging social status." He laughed sadly. "I wasn't." "What were you judging?" He looked at me. "The values that made you who you are." My throat tightened, because that was exactly the truth. Not just about my father. About all of them. My mother, my grandfather, the generations before them. The values that shaped me. Duty, humility, service, responsibility, sacrifice. Things that don't show up on bank statements, yet somehow matter more than money ever could. That evening back at the hotel, Richard sat quietly for a long time. Finally, he spoke. "Can I ask you something?" "Of course." He hesitated, then asked the question that mattered most. "Do you think your father would forgive me?" I stared at him. Not because the question surprised me, because I already knew the answer. I thought about my father, the countless sailors he had mentored, the mistakes he'd forgiven, the grace he'd extended, the patience he'd shown. Then I smiled softly. "Yes." Richard looked relieved. "But..." The word stopped him. I continued. "He'd expect you to learn from it." Richard nodded immediately. "I have." I believed him, not because he said it, because I had watched it happen, day by day, conversation by conversation, choice by choice. When we returned to Charleston, something subtle had changed. The tension between us hadn't completely disappeared. Trust doesn't rebuild overnight. Neither does respect. But for the first time in a long time, we were moving in the right direction. Not backward, forward, together. And as I looked at the old Navy watch resting on my wrist one evening, I realized something important. The greatest revenge had never been public humiliation. It wasn't watching Richard feel embarrassed. It wasn't seeing him criticized. Real revenge was something much quieter. Watching someone finally understand the value of what they once dismissed. Watching ignorance become wisdom. Watching pride become humility. Watching a man become better than he was before. And for the first time since the gala, I began to wonder whether our story might still have a hopeful ending. A year later, I found myself standing in the same ballroom where everything had begun. The same crystal chandeliers. The same harbor view. The same annual charity gala. Even the same string quartet played softly near the stage. Yet somehow the room felt entirely different. Or perhaps I was the one who had changed. Maybe both. I adjusted the sleeve of my evening dress and glanced at the old navy watch on my wrist. My father's watch. The watch that had quietly carried his legacy into that ballroom a year earlier. The watch that had revealed truths neither Richard nor I were prepared to face. A year, 12 short months, and yet it felt much longer. Because growth has a way of stretching time. Richard approached carrying 2 glasses of sparkling water. He handed one to me. His smile was relaxed. Natural. Not the carefully polished smile he used to wear at social events. A genuine one. "Ready?" he asked. I nodded. "As ready as I'll ever be." He chuckled. "That's usually your answer." "Because it's usually true." We shared a laugh. A simple moment. The kind married couples often overlook. Yet after the previous year I appreciated those moments more than ever. Richard had changed. Not perfectly. Nobody changes perfectly. At 62 years old, he still loved business. Still enjoyed ambitious projects. Still appreciated success, but success no longer defined his entire worldview. The shift wasn't dramatic. It was visible in small choices, the most meaningful kind. He had begun volunteering with veteran organizations, quietly, without publicity, without posting photos, without announcing it to anyone. He simply showed up, week after week, month after month, helping where he could, learning where he couldn't, listening more than talking. The first time I saw him unloading supplies at a veterans housing program, I nearly cried. Not because he was volunteering, because nobody had asked him to. Several months earlier, General Bradley had invited us to lunch. The 3 of us sat together overlooking Charleston Harbor. The conversation drifted from military history to family aging and purpose. At one point, the general leaned back and smiled at Richard. "You've come a long way." Richard laughed. "I had a good teacher." The general pointed toward me. "No." Then he pointed toward the watch. "Your teacher was wearing that watch long before either of us met her." The 3 of us sat quietly for a moment. Then General Bradley added something I'll never forget. "The greatest leaders don't leave behind wealth." He paused. "They leave behind values." Even now those words echo in my mind. Because they're true. As the gala continued, guests moved through the ballroom. Some recognized me. Some didn't. That was perfectly fine. I've never needed attention. Neither had my father. Across the room I noticed several veterans gathered near a display honoring local service members. Richard was speaking with them, not as a businessman, not as a donor, simply as another human being. Listening, learning, respecting. A year ago, I never would have imagined that scene. Yet there it was. Real. Quiet. Meaningful. Later in the evening, the event organizer stepped onto the stage. After welcoming guests, she invited several community leaders to stand for recognition. Richard's name was among them. He looked surprised. Genuinely surprised. As polite applause filled the room, he reluctantly stood. Then something happened that touched me deeply. The organizer asked each honoree to briefly introduce themselves. One by one, they spoke about businesses, organizations, and accomplishments. Eventually, it was Richard's turn. He walked to the microphone. The ballroom grew quiet. I watched him carefully. Curious what he would say. A year earlier, he would have listed achievements, projects, investments, professional successes. Instead, he smiled and looked toward me. Then he said, "My name is Richard Collins." A brief pause followed. "I'm fortunate to be married to an extraordinary woman." I felt my face grow warm. The room laughed softly. Richard continued, "She comes from a family that spent generations serving others." His voice grew steadier. "A family that taught me an important lesson." The ballroom remained silent, listening. Real greatness isn't measured by money. He glanced toward me. It's measured by character. I felt tears forming. Not because of the audience, not because of the applause, because I knew how difficult those words had been for him to earn. He wasn't repeating something he had heard. He believed it. That made all the difference. After the event ended, we stepped outside onto the harbor terrace. The night air felt cool. Boats moved slowly across the dark water. City lights shimmered in the distance. For several minutes, we simply stood together. No speeches. No dramatic declarations. Just peace. Finally, Richard spoke. "You know something. What? I used to think your father was the most impressive person in this story." I smiled. "He probably is." Richard shook his head. "No." I looked at him. He squeezed my hand. "You are." Emotion caught in my throat. "Why?" His answer came immediately. Because you could have humiliated me. I laughed softly. You handled that yourself. He laughed too. Then his expression became serious. You could have walked away. I didn't respond. Because he was right. There had been moments when leaving seemed easier. Moments when anger felt justified. Moments when bitterness would have been understandable. Yet my father had taught me something important. People are more than their worst moments. Sometimes they deserve the opportunity to become better. Not always. But sometimes Richard had earned that opportunity. And thankfully he had used it well. As we stood there overlooking Charleston Harbor, I thought about my father, my grandfather, my mother, the generations who had shaped me. None of them had been wealthy. None of them had sought recognition. Yet their influence remained alive. Not through monuments, not through headlines, through values. Values passed from one life to another, one family member to another, one generation to the next. That is how legacies survive. Not in bank accounts, in people. I looked down at my father's watch. The hands continued moving steadily. Tick, tick, tick. Time passing, just as it always had. For the first time since his death, I felt something close to peace. Not because people finally knew who he was. He never would have cared about that. Because the lessons he spent a lifetime teaching were still alive. Still working. Still changing lives. Even Richard's. Especially Richard's. And perhaps that's the greatest legacy any of us can hope to leave behind. If this story reminded you of someone who quietly served, sacrificed, or shaped your life without asking for recognition, take a moment to think about them today. And if you've ever learned an important lesson from someone you once misunderstood, I'd love for you to share that experience. Stories like these help us remember what truly matters. Thank you for spending this time with me. Take care of yourselves, take care of one another, and never underestimate the quiet people in the room. Sometimes they're carrying the greatest stories of all.